It's great seeing so many of you this morning. So I'll do a very brief intro so we leave more time for valuable discussions. I'll tell you what this event is about and also why do we do this. So this event is a 2-day event. This is the first day, February 19th is the second day. So you see on the PowerPoint slide Kimberly put up, it says HeRo. Most of you know what it's about. For those who don't, HeRo stands for Healthcare Robotics. So a few years ago, Professor Goldinajet and Professor Eric Diller, so mostly three of us discussed the possibility of applying to NSERC for funding for a training program. It's not really a research program. It's called NSERC Create program. It's for training grad students and postdocs. So we applied and we made it. So our title was NSERC Create Healthcare Robotics. That's why HeRo. So HeRo, the purpose of doing this program and today's event is to create a platform to tie our trainees in healthcare robotics together, and also to let them interact, give them opportunities to interact with industry, to tie faculty together, to have stronger cohesion. So I haven't told you what HeRo healthcare robotics. I don't think healthcare robotics has a clear definition internationally, but to us, healthcare robotics has three pillars or three themes. One is surgical. The second is rehabilitation. The third is assistive robotics. So those are the three pillars or themes in our HeRo program. And that's the three areas everyone in today's event works in, one of them. So that's the purpose of HeRo. And briefly, today's event, HeRo Summit Day 1, we fortunately invited half leaders from surgeons, end users, industry leaders, and I very much look forward to learning as well, not only our trainees. I also look forward to hearing their discussion. Let's pay attention to their views. A lot of you in the healthcare robotics course, MIE 1080, we heard invited lecturers to speak to us about market assessment, about patenting strategy, about design issues. So we know that healthcare robotics involves more than technical aspects. So it's important for us to learn also from end users of robotic systems and also industry perspectives. Of course, academic, technological contents are also important. So they will all show up today. I think it will be a great event. And before we get started, I need to, not a formality, I really need to thank a few people in particular. One is Kimberly, our today's coordinator, who did almost all the work putting the program together. Kimberly is our program manager of Robotics Institute, working with all of us, and also with our associate director, Holly Siegel. I also need to thank Professor Rosalie Wang. I'll do a very brief intro. Rosalie is from Toronto Rehabilitation Institute. She's an expert in rehabilitation robotics, and she also works with a large network of therapists, with professionals, and end users of robotic systems. Our second host today, I need to thank, is Professor Animesh Garg. So both of them, Animesh is a professor in computer science, UTM, Mississauga. So both are invaluable members of our robotics institutes, among others. So without further ado, I think I need to give the floor to Kimberly so we can kick off today's program. I look forward to it and hope all of you will enjoy it as well.
Thank you
one
so
last
much.
sentence, Kimberly, sorry, one last sentence. I need to say that the pandemic becomes very boring and distressing And although pandemic separates us physically, all of us look forward to getting back to in the classroom to be together. But I believe our community, healthcare robotics community and the larger robotics community is strong as ever. So I hope we all attend our events and exchange information, and let's continue to go through this difficult time and boring time. So Kimberly, please.
Thank you for that very heartwarming message. And now I will say some mechanical things. Dylan, if you could skip ahead to 2 slides to the Zoom links. This is, as you notice, this is not in the webinar format. That's to increase the communication and ability for us to have open conversation later in the day. But until then and during the panels, for the best viewing experience, if you make sure to click the caret next to start video, and toggle hide non-video participants, and then have your video off during the presentations, and then we can turn it on after the panels and trainee presentations are over. And if you do that also in gallery view, then you'll sort of get the same webinar effect, and we have the best of both worlds. Go ahead, next slide. And so we have our first panel is how might we maximize adoption of healthcare robotics in clinical settings. On behalf of Animesh, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. Next slide. So first we have Vitor Mendez Pereira. He is a neurosurgeon specializing in minimally invasive procedures of the intracranial and spinal circulation and percutaneous spinal interventions for pain management. He's a professor of medical imaging and surgery at the University of Toronto and a staff physician at the Western Hospital and Hospital for Sick Kids. Thank you so much for being here, Vitor. And if obviously the panelists could go ahead and leave their video on, that would be perfect, thanks. We're also joined by Tim Fielding. He's the product development manager for medical at MDA. MDA is, I'm sure everybody knows, but just to make sure, it's Canada's leading space company and has decades of experience with robotics for space missions. Tim has worked on applying know-how from space programs to medical robotics with a variety of academic and commercial partners. Thanks so much for joining us, Tim. And then finally, we have Aman Thind from Kanavi. He's the CTO and co-founder of Kanavi Medical. Kanavi Medical is a Toronto-based medical device company that provides catheter-based image guidance solutions for the interventional cardiology community. He completed a PhD at the University of Toronto in medical biophysics. Thank you so much, Aman, for being here. And without further ado, I will turn things over to Animesh Garg. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kimberly. I think thanks everyone for joining us today. This has been I'm very much looking forward to the session. I am hoping that we will use this time today in a format where first I would like to discuss and hear views on our pointer question, where we have a very sort of broad-minded, what you might call a prompt. How might we think about maximizing adoption in healthcare, particularly for robotics in clinical settings? And then we can sort of start with a few questions that I have prepared, and hopefully that will kickstart us with questions from the audience as well. So with that, let's maybe go left to right. Maybe let's start with Writer, and that would be a good 5-minute start for an opening sentence, opening salvo from Vitor.
So good morning, everybody. Thanks for the invitation to be here. It's my pleasure, and I'm also, as you, an enthusiast of robotics. Our current experience with robotics consists of developing and adapting an endovascular system to perform minimally invasive brain surgery. So we have up to date completed 21 cases of surgeries that we perform actually through the vessels and we can reach the diseases and some vessels in the brain, and then we can perform them almost completely robotically. This has been a successful experience, and this was the first time that we could perform a brain surgery using robotics. Other robotic activities that we do spine surgery, that we have a robotic system to support the positioning of the screws. And we also have a number of diagnostic tools. And lately, the most recent one has been a Doppler, transcranial Doppler, which is an imaging that we actually have to perform manually and find a window to actually use a Doppler to assess the vessels intracranially through the bone. And now we have a system that we've been studying and assessing that uses robotics and AI to actually autonomously perform the exam for us. And I see robotics as a partner in the clinical field. It improves our ergonomics and improves the precision of the procedures. And if I'm speaking how I see and how I use robotics right now, but to expand what we are doing already now, I think the future, at least in the neurosurgery domain, will be to perform remote procedures. I think that will be actually what will improve and the access to procedures. We have some procedures that, depending on the time to actually be successfully and actually change and improve the clinical outcome of the patients. And we have countries like Canada with distances there sometimes impeditive to most of the procedures. And I think if we can, I see the future of robotics in neurosurgery, neuroscience, in the surgical robotics, expanding by adding remote treatment, remote diagnosis, telemedicine, and that's what I think the future is preparing for us in my domain in medicine.
That's wonderfully spoken. Thank you so much. And Kimberly, do you want to keep this slide shared so that we can have that up if you want? Otherwise, it may be just a screen. So I think we'll continue. So before we get into questions, of course, this is the one key thing that Vitor sort of mentioned this today, primarily is that we should have remote procedures, which is actually a very important sort of setup that we will have. This has guided a lot of technology development over the years, and we will sort of revisit this as we discuss the kind of technologies that might be used for adoption. With that, I would like to sort of ask Tim to express his views, and then we'll want to move on to Aman. So Tim, go ahead.
Thank you very much for having me on the panel and asking for some thoughts. Hello to everyone, and yes, this is an awkward situation for all. I think you said boring was one description of it. Yes, it would be great to get back and see everyone face to face, but for now, we'll deal with what we have. So thanks for having me. That was a really a great kind of description of some of the promise that robotics can bring to healthcare. In particular, precision in neurosurgery. There's lots of promise there. Neurosurgery takes advantage of advanced imaging. It needs precision for these interventions, and there's room for improvement. And the aspect of using like that imaging and like digital technology allows you to expand the reach of and using robotics, expand the reach from just a local having to be right there with the patient to potentially being able to do this all remotely. There's all kinds of technology that's been developed over the years. I've been lucky enough to be part of some of this evolution over my career. From the 90s and even earlier, robotics has had a lot of excitement around it, a lot of promise in healthcare. But I think, based on the topic of this discussion, it's been slow coming. Adoption has been slow for a variety of reasons, and of course we want to explore those a little bit in our panel today. Yeah, so that's it's important to keep in mind, and I think Dr. Sun very early on in the introduction talked about one of the keys, and that we have to keep focused on. It's not just about the technology. I think the group here is probably believers in robotics and what it can do and the promise, but understanding why you would use robotics in a particular application and what value it brings. I think that's one of the keys. That's one of the keys to wider adoption. And then, of course, we have to keep our eye on what barriers there are to that adoption. But the first step is understanding the value that robotics can bring. And maybe I'll leave it there, and we can talk more about the details as we get into the panel.
I think that's actually a very good point as well. So I will sort of summarize Tim's point as if to sort of have newer technologies, particularly in robotics, increasingly being used, one of the things, or one of the key challenges as technologists we need to solve is to justify value of this cutting-edge technology. And this is, of course, in addition to what we just said in terms of the ability to do remote procedures. So over to you, Amma.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be part of this panel. And I think what Tim touched on is very critical to how we can drive adoption here. The technology is absolutely a critical portion of it, but you can have the best technology in the world, and there are several other barriers that we'll need to overcome. And and I think one of the big ones is psychological. I recall having a conversation with a pretty high-ranking executive at a medical device company whose opinion was that as long as I'm alive, no robot will ever perform surgery on me. There are many aspects beyond the technology itself that are absolutely critical and necessary to discuss. I mean, Vitor had spoken about the possibility of remote remote surgical procedures, which is absolutely has huge potential for field procedures, either because there isn't time to bring somebody into a traditional operating theater, or you're in a remote part of the country, and sort of the logistics of getting the trained surgeons up there is very difficult. There's so much beyond. There's huge technological challenges to developing that type of thing, but even beyond that, some of the cybersecurity risks, for instance, are other aspects that are beyond sort of the core technology that are potential impediments to getting this type of thing up and running. And there's, I think, everybody, we probably wouldn't be here if we didn't believe that there's huge potential in robotics for healthcare in any number of the scope can vary very really broadly. But no, I look forward to the rest of this discussion to talk about the technology and beyond, all the other sort of aspects that need to be considered.
That's actually yet another sort of pillar, according to me, what Aman mentioned, in addition to the existence of technology, which Vitor mentioned. Then there was justifying the value. And then the third part is actually, how do we drive adoption to ensure, particularly because you're operating in a relatively conservative field where doctors are taught to be procedural by design. and not to change procedure on the fly based on instinct. That is part of the training. So this is sort of like they're at the complete opposite end of operationalizing things compared to, let's say, technologists. So how do we convince doctors to make the jump, and what sort of procedures and let's say incentives should be created? So, okay, what I've done is I've prepared like a series of sort of at least hopefully thought-provoking questions that I would love to get your opinion on. I get to be the first one to ask questions as a part of the host, but hopefully the audience will have questions as we move along the process. So the way we can think about this from the perspective of kind of questions we can ask is the kind of stakeholders we have in this process. There are three stakeholders, according to me, mainly to think about this. One is the technologists, the folks who are trying to develop in technology, not necessarily from a clinical perspective. Think engineers, think software developers, think robotics people. Then there are people who are what you would call on the clinical side of things, but who hold the keys on the clinical side of things. So surgeons, but not only surgeons, of course. There are people who are in hospital management who have the ability to sort of drive adoption through maybe change, let's say, how insurance works, or how we can sort of like actually make sure that the hospital is covered for trying out these new things, right? So the clinical adopters. But the third thing which we should discuss and hopefully we'll get to is also often the kind of stakeholders who usually do not get a seat at tables like these today. It's the patients, right? Does the patient get a say in all of this, right? And there have been recent studies actually which showed that sometimes the adoption is actually driven by patients. If patient tells you that I want to get a robotic sort of a robotic procedure for, let's say, prostatectomy or something like that, things that are more common, things that they are very likely to have heard about from their circles, then that will drive adoption as well, right? So if every patient wants the prostatectomy to be minimally invasive, laparoscopically done on a robot, because they believe they heard that that's the way it is done. So anything that is done in the old school method is not going to sort of fly with them. So that's yet another sort of, I would say, mechanism that a technologist can sort of appeal to. So instead of directly appealing to the clinical patient, the clinical persons, you can always go to the patient, market your product to the patient. Okay, so let's start from a technologist perspective in terms of questions. In terms of technology itself, from the kind of things, let's say, the problems we need to be working on, as Vidar pointed out, remote procedures is the next sort of set of challenges. But I would not argue remote procedures are new in that sense, right? There have been companies built on this idea for many years. What would you think are the big technological barriers that are in front of us in terms of, let's say, to start with remote surgery first? So there are, of course, different paradigms or different sort of specialties within surgery, and we can take the answers start from Vitor, because you started with neurosurgery, but I'm sure there are probably things that you might be able to mention about other specialties as well.
Yeah, so thank you very much. This is a good point. I think today, if we think about robotic surgery, the biggest system that we have today that is widely used is the Da Vinci, and abdominal, pelvic, thoracic surgery, some skull-based surgery, more than 70,000 surgeons operating and trained to be managing hospitals in US, some centers in Europe. There are surgical robotic surgical centers, and they brand themselves as actually performing everything, as most of the procedures that they can robotically. And this is this is one system that is widely used. Then we have the spinal robotics and the orthopedic robotics. We have a system called Mason to do knee surgery. It did increase the safety and the value of robotic surgery when you are performing knee surgery, because the robot prevent some complications during the procedure that are often seen. So this is probably one big domain, orthopedics, that is actually growing more and more. And in neurosurgery, we have the endovascular systems that are easier to adapt to robotics, because we perform surgeries through the vessels. We don't need to do craniotomies or access the skull base. And then this is something that recently has gained a lot of attention too. And in medicine, the way to convince surgeons to perform or to change their practice is actually by clinical studies. And we have examples of stroke treatment, cardiac angioplasties. They changed completely once we had a randomized study showing the value of it. And you will have people like me that will be pioneers, and you will have doctors that will be also waiting for this technology to use, don't need anything to convince. But the great majority of the physicians will actually wait for the clinical data or something that will demonstrate that it's safer or more effective to actually change their practice. So I think the next steps, that once we have the good techniques, is to actually move towards producing value clinical data to actually demonstrate to the other group of physicians that don't have this pioneer drive to actually use and adapt it into the clinical settings.
That's actually a good point. Before we move on to next questions, I do want to I'd love to hear Tim and Aman's view as well on the same sort of prompt, which is, what, according to you, would be game-changing technologies with, let's say, highest marginal values?
There's a lot to pick up on and from Vitor's comments there. Yeah, before maybe answering that question directly. The example he gave of the Da Vinci systems is a really interesting one. Spent a lot of time talking about that. It actually started as a military was interested in telesurgery. And one thing to I guess always keep in mind is with many of these procedures that we're targeting with robotics, there is a way to deal with the current, whatever the current paradigm is. There's competition. It's not necessarily another robotic system. There are other procedures and ways to deal with what's being done now. So the Da Vinci system is interesting in that it was conceived of as trying to bring healthcare closer to the front lines of a battlefield, because that's a critical time to treat injuries. There's this concept of a golden hour, but the closer you can bring treatment to the time of injury, generally the better the outcomes. And so that was the kind of thought behind it. And the interesting thing is that the competition for that kind of paradigm, that system, that robot, that concept is actually the logistics of transporting people rapidly from the front lines to a care center that's a little bit further back, that's better equipped. So that's the thing that you have to compete against. And as it turns out, military is pretty good at logistics and evacuating, and it's actually pretty hard to bring that capability forward with all its sophistication. So it never really took off and got traction. There was a lot of development and interest in the 90s and kind of that time frame, but it just didn't get anywhere. So that was a barrier that I don't think was overcome. And there are parallels in non-military applications for that kind of thing, that if we think about remote surgery, we have to think about those issues too. You're competing against what's done now, which is transporting the smallest number of people that have maybe complicated conditions that can't be treated in a more rural setting. But the other interesting thing about the Da Vinci case is that it morphed. So that technology, originally conceived as the military telepresence type surgery, it morphed to a different value proposition. And that value proposition was enhanced dexterity for surgeons, whether it's thoracic or their first application that took off was prostate surgery. And the enhanced dexterity that the robotic system could bring to prostate surgery actually made a difference, although that's debated as well. But and then the value of that difference compared to the costs, that became the big debate. But that's really what enabled it. So fundamentally, it was a different value proposition that drove that technology to adoption. So it's an interesting case about what understanding the value that the robotic system or technology brings to the healthcare system, and then and making sure that you deliver on that. So that was it was an interesting case to bring up because of all those elements.
Can I just take advantage of Tim's comment on the diabetes and the prostate? And this is an interesting topic, but since we could never, with a randomized setting, demonstrate the real benefit,
yeah,
it delayed the adoption, and the adoption also involves reimbursement. And everything in medicine moves forward with the correct reimbursement that you will get for that procedure.
yeah.
And then if the system is not convinced and they will not reimburse for the robotic procedure, you will actually cannot expand the use of robotic for that particular case until you have that clinical favorable evidence-based scenario showing that it's superior to the regular practice.
Yeah, and no, absolutely. And it's tough. So you kind of, mapped out the adoption kind of process of, opinion leaders and clinical studies and getting evidence, and then that adoption and the bulk of clinical adoption is somewhat conservative, and justifiably so. I would really be interested to hear Aman's comments on that process and how that is actually it's its own barrier to adoption. The length of that process, the funding that's required to enable that process is one of the barriers for kind of technology to make it from experiments and demonstration in a research setting to commercial clinical use. Oh, I don't know if Aman's
So Aman mentioned that I think the connection is dropping.
Yeah,
so we can wait for him to come back. I think that's actually a good point that both of you mentioned, that particularly sort of other forces such as, let's say, will the procedure be reimbursed for the clinic, for the patient, actually has a lot of effect in adoption completely. And
stay stable.
And then these independent randomized studies actually help, let's say, convince insurance companies to be able to underwrite something like that. Aman is back with us today. Aman. So we would love to hear from you, Aman, if you can hear us, about what you would believe are sort of the major, let's say, technological barriers, or the kind of most biggest marginal technological gains to be had. Aman?
Looks like he might be frozen again. I've had these things before.
Yes, I think it happens. So while we are sort of waiting for Aman, I do have one thing to add and ask, rather, to throw in the sort of like ring. Often when we think of technology, particularly robotics in healthcare, we always tend to focus on, let's say, the elephant in the room, which would basically be how can robots help in surgery? But you could also argue that there's a lot of value to be had in non-surgical ancillary sort of help. So think telenursing, think diagnosis. And there are a number of these sort of hospital tasks that still require physical presence. So it's not purely what you would call go read x-rays kind of thing, or go read sort of test results, but actually helping patients in the front room, maybe doing scrub tech stuff in the OR. And there are these tasks that could really help the surgeon improve their own performance, because this is the next level of technology. Maybe any comments on that?
Aman, yeah.
We believe you have Aman back.
All right.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
My apologies, everybody. Can you
we
guys
threw the
hear me
ball
okay?
to you. Yeah, we can hear you now. We threw the ball over to you just as your connection went.
Okay. Yeah, no, my apologies. And we talk about remote surgery. One of the pitfalls is establishing reliable connections in all different environments. And so,
well, good demonstration then. Yes, absolutely. Well done.
I'm sure you very well staged this.
just as I had planned.
Yep.
So, one of the other things, as we talk about, the challenges in developing this technology, and Tim, my apologies, I didn't hear, I kind of heard you intermittently as you were sort of asking for my thoughts on things. So if I get this wrong, please do correct me. But one of the major challenges of developing medical technologies is, I've watched our company grow from a three-person purely R&D company to developing sort of commercial capabilities and dealing with regulatory aspects and all of that. When you and especially as devices become more and more invasive, one of the challenges to have your development team, your engineers, is really the fact that when you're developing commercial devices, you're developing an app, you're developing a lot of these other types of things. The people who are developing it can have a real feel for how end user will work with it, because in many cases they are the end user, or they're able to prototype and test in sort of real field settings. And this disconnect between trying to get that communication from the real clinical need to the development team to build something, a lot can get lost in that translation. And we've constantly had that challenge, even though our CEO is an interventional cardiologist. We have a lot of that clinical background and that kind of thing. But just the fact that the people developing the technology will never be the ones that are actually using it, it's a pretty substantial barrier to overcome. And you really have to maximize that communication by the end users and all the stakeholders, to be honest. From the customer's perspective, from all those perspectives, right? Like a lot of engineers will think, hey, I've got this lag time down to X milliseconds. And from a technology perspective, that sort of response time, that lag time, makes all of the difference. One of my children had a birthday this weekend, and we had done this remote Zoom call, and everybody's trying to sing happy birthday in tune, and everything's off by just a little bit, and it just sounds like an absolute mess. And in absolute terms, that lag or that gap is very, very minimal. But in practical terms, for the actual end use, it's a huge factor. And so making sure that those requirements of either feedback time or lag or those kinds of things is absolutely critical, and making sure that that's clearly communicated. So I'm not sure if that answered what you were asking of me, Tim, but that is one perspective that's become very clear to me over the years, that is a challenge for developing invasive devices.
I think that's actually that's one definite sort of important perspective. So maybe that sort of is a perfect sort of segue into the next set of problems. So one of the problems, as Aman mentioned, is building robotics technologies, or any sort of technologies for that matter, particularly for clinicians, is challenging for scientists, because two issues happen. One is it's very hard to think or sort of like think from the perspective of a clinician, because they have a very specialized sort of training that, let's say, engineers may or may not have. An engineer may be biased to thinking only in terms of, or with technological tools, hey, this does sort of like, as someone mentioned, reduces lag or achieves certain sort of metrics and so on and so forth. How do we think about challenges in this particular setup where we know our adopters are famously conservative? As Vitor pointed, there are two things that we are sort of guiding against here. And I read about this in preparation for this. Is there are two kinds of solutions you can build. I can look at what you're doing right now, Vitor, and say, okay, hey, you are using a particular process right now. I will try to not change it or minimally change it, yet give you the sort of clinical advantage in outcomes or something, right? But if I'm trying to do something like radically different, right? So there's like, you will have to somehow stop this, whatever you're doing, and then move over. As Tim was mentioning, right? That even though you do this whole sort of process of randomized training and all of that, at some point of time, there needs to be switch over, right? Even if other clinicians who are may or may not be pioneers, we may sort of need to retrain a lot of people. And that comes with both sort of procedural costs, a cost, and rather just a paradigm shift. So in that sense, but personally, I find what Intuitive has done, even over a 20-year period, seems remarkable, because that's like super fast in those skills, right? They have changed the game only in 20 years rather than in 20 years. So I want to sort of ask all three of you, what are both challenges and perhaps even solution strategies that have worked for each of you in your own experiences?
So I can start, I think, from a physician perspective. To your comment before, other robotic areas, other than surgically, will make robots more present at the hospital. I think this is easier to implement. So it took me 2 years to do the first brain surgery and using a robot, and it took me a week to use a Doppler and set up in the diagnostic area and get everybody used and trained to it. So I think having more robotics, telecompanion, telepresence, as you mentioned, in the hospital or on the transportation, that helps just everybody at the hospital to get used to the adaptation of the technology. And to your point now regarding the how the physician, the adoption of the surgery itself, we are very used to innovation. We are used to change to new devices and to be retrained. This is something that we are used to, but I think there is still a big barrier when we will cross the line towards robotics, because at least the feedback that I got when I did the first cases and everybody wanted to know how and what was that kind of technology, what the physicians are afraid is the automation step. And what everybody is afraid is when it will become automated and I will not be necessary. And this is some kind of probably that is in the back of some conservative colleagues that will probably never join the robotic evolution in medicine and in surgery, but we don't need them. I mean, these are like 10-15% of people that will never change. But the great majority, I think, if we follow these steps and whenever there will have clinical evidence, we are used to change devices, to change procedures, and to be retrained. So I think this is not a problem for at least the current surgical practice in medicine.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem. And yeah, there's the early adopters and key opinion leaders for sure. And you're right. I think the majority of clinical practitioners, I mean, they attend conferences, they take the latest technology, and they're looking for the best way to take care of their patients. So that's I think that's true. But there is a sweet spot. If you're, introducing new technology, there is current practice. Like I said, you have to acknowledge that there's a current way of doing things. You want to be sufficiently differentiated that it's worthwhile making a change. If it's just marginally better, people aren't, there's an investment to be made in terms of retraining, changing the way you just go about your day. So it has to be worthwhile to make that change, to learn a new thing. As I get older, I learn fewer and fewer new things. Social media platforms come out and I can't be bothered, right? There has to be enough of a benefit in order to drive adoption. So the flip side of that is too much can be a problem as well. And it has problems not only with personal adoption, understanding and bringing it on board, but the whole regulatory process. There is infrastructure around not too much differentiation, or introducing something that's totally different from current medical practice requires a different standard of evidence than something that is an incremental improvement but doesn't fundamentally change the way current practice medicine is delivered. So even going to a regulatory body like the FDA, there's fundamentally different paths you can take, and they have different timelines, and they have different evidence requirements, and they have different costs. So it's a balance between sufficient differentiation, but not too much differentiation in order to have something that can be adopted and can be afforded for the benefit it brings. Anyway, I'll stop talking right now. Maybe Amani could chime in.
Yeah, no, I actually like to build a little bit on what Tim is saying, because you're absolutely correct. If you are going to change things drastically, it has to be a lot better. It can't be a little bit better. And then typically when you make that level of change, the cost in terms of actually proving outcomes is very substantial in terms of the required investment. The regulatory process, especially in the US, where you have these very divergent regulatory pathways, where it's sort of this Me Too type situation, where it's like, I'm substantially equivalent to something else that's already out there, and there's a pretty substantially accelerated path going there, versus going a complete new novel technology that it's probably a factor of 2 or 3 in terms of the required investment to go down one path versus the other. And so if you are, if you are going to come up with a completely new workflow that's going to require completely new training, potentially new, capital expenditures, capital equipment, major changes to the operating theaters or the operating labs, it requires a huge amount of time and money and commitment for, before you can even get to the point of determining whether or not it's going to provide benefit. So there are these kind of divergent, situations where, you can make incremental improvements and you can do them, with relatively low burden, but they're only going to be incremental improvements. So it's an absolutely massive consideration when you talk about the regulatory pathways. And I think even more so, you talk about automating procedures. I think even bigger than that is the concept of AI, which potentially has huge impact in the robotic space. But the regulators, to be quite honest, and not to their fault, don't really know how to regulate. The current structures of regulatory review and that process, it doesn't really. It isn't well suited for something like AI, right? It's all about, here's a deterministic thing that we are going to build it. This is how it's going to operate. This is how we can test it. Where it's going to sort of learn and adapt and sort of not be predictable in that way is a very new. It's not a new concept. We've been talking about this for decades. But in terms of how to sufficiently regulate that, it's a huge challenge. So again, I don't want to be rambling about this, but there's a lot of different considerations depending on the level of change that we're talking about.
That's actually a very good comment, I would argue. All three of you echoed this. So the next sort of question I have here, so now I want to drive the conversation to make this sort of not just about the problems, but also not just the technical problems, but actually beyond that. So the first question I want to ask is, one of the things that, let's say, these ideas of regulatory processes that enable adoption, or that sort of go hand in hand with adoption. The outcomes of these regulatory processes have been very different in different ecosystems, despite what you might say the availability of other factors. So let's say the same sort of density of technologies are available in Europe, in Canada, and in the US. I would argue that we in Toronto have done better than average. There is a reason why Toronto and Ontario has a higher density of, let's say, biomedical companies than other places. So maybe just a commentary on, and maybe even we can pat ourselves on the back. What are we doing right, and perhaps where can we improve?
Yeah,
So,
I think,
Vito, yes, go ahead.
yeah, I think this kind of collaboration, it's key to increase the dialogue and actually make the development way faster. So we have a collaboration with Professor Sun and Rosalie since last year, and we have grown towards writing grants and working together. I think we have to be closer because at the end user and the problems on the clinical side has to come together with the development to actually make a solution that will be impactful and will really change practice to then go to the other steps that we discussed before. I think the close collaboration in industry and academic level between all the stakeholders, healthcare and the engineering team, I think it's key. And I add also to the engineering team, the computer science and AI, because as Aman said, I think this will take a big part of the development of the new systems in the future.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think Toronto, yeah, if we want to pat ourselves on the back, we have a kind of a world-class infrastructure with our educational institutions and the clinical practice that's all down on College Street, and that interaction of technical capabilities and clinical practice, all in such close proximity is critical to identifying problems and identifying technology that could potentially address those problems. Yeah, that interaction is really important. I want to actually maybe link this to a comment you made before. Like, we've talked a lot about the kind of high profile applications for robotics, things like surgeries, and there are lots of people working on that. But this kind of infrastructure it facilitates, kind of bringing out some of these other problems that may not be as obvious, that there are good technical solutions. But I think of like Toronto Rehab, for example, being there, and some of the technologies there, that robotics can have different value propositions depending on how you apply it. So it could be a very high stakes intervention, like a brain surgery, in which case that action has a high value associated with it, and it has to be done precisely. And that's the value robotics brings. But the other value that robotics brings historically, one of them is repetitive action. And those interactions could be perhaps of lower value individually, but the value of a robot is it could do things over and over, and it doesn't mind doing things over and over. Again, maybe in the rehab space, or supporting people in home care. Those value propositions for robotics might be, well, they come out when people can collaborate and talk to each other. And they also potentially have a lower burden in terms of regulatory pathway, because they're perhaps each of those transactions less risky. When a robot's doing maybe stroke rehab or something like that, it's valuable, but in the kind of cumulative effect that the robotic system has interacting with the patient. So yeah, there are different ways to think about this.
Aman?
Yeah, in terms of what, talking about the community in Toronto, and I absolutely agree that, from a, the technical schools in Southern Ontario are very, very strong. And, there's a lot of really good research that goes on, collaborations between, for early technical feasibility. I think where we struggle a little is in terms of that actual translation to full clinical, the full cycle piece of it. A lot of our technologies will get picked up by some of the larger companies, or but the innovation community in Toronto, and I think Canada in general, isn't quite to the level that it is in some places in the U.S. or in other parts of the world. Where the investment community really gets, the long game of sort of medical technology development. A lot of there's plenty of investment money in Canada, but it's the investor base is a lot more comfortable with the traditional sort of traditional things. It has been oil and gas, not so much anymore, but real estate, consumption of natural resources, and to some extent, technology that's relatively low barrier to entry in terms of app development and those kinds of things. But things that require these really large capital investments and don't see returns for a significant period of time are not as well funded in Canada as they are in other parts of the world. In particular, you look at obviously Silicon Valley or the Boston area, or a few others in Israel as well, that sort of have this sort of full cycle process for this type of technology.
This actually is perfect segue. I think you guys have preempted my questions to begin with, it seems. So the next question was, so we have discussed this from a technology perspective, from the perspective of like clinicians. One of the things particularly that may be relevant to the audience today, a large chunk of the audience today is students who have worked on these problems or are working on these problems for their grad careers. Now, one of the issues that is a very practical issue is a lot of professors and teams are working on this, but the work actually gets done at the quanta of, let's say, a grad student lifetime. A grad student lifetime is maybe 4 or 5 years in the sort of like process. Even if I'm very focused, I have discovered the problem early on in my career, often the outcome of my PhD will be evaluated on the impact of the work that I've done, right? So if I've chosen a problem where I was able to do some sort of very initial feasibility study, then but I'm not able to actually convince after graduation that, hey, look, this is a very cool thing to be doing, and I'm not interested in startup, but finding opportunities, whether in companies or other small startups, that I have the right experience and the right, let's say, training to do interesting stuff. It's very hard or challenging for students in the space to showcase the impact of their work because of the lengthy timescales of these processes. How or what can we do as, let's say, holders of the keys from perspective of the like industrial sort of setup, from perspective of the clinicians and maybe guidance to us as faculty? What can we do here to improve outcomes? How do we align incentives such that progress happens at the quanta of their sort of lifetime, where they have things to sort of show when they step out of the process to get next set of opportunities?
Yeah, from I think from a end user on the healthcare side, I think there is a number of different opportunities. This is probably the perfect time to jump into the field because it's everything is yet to be developed. So there's a number of ideas on how you can innovate, explore. Our focus has been and will be on treating stroke remotely. There's everything to set. I think if I encourage the students to get involved in the projects and understand these nuances that we discussed here that touch robotics in the healthcare system, but then after it will opens your door to startups that will come out of some of these projects, or other ones that will certainly be formed to actually have at least some of the challenge that we will face, like remote surgery, data transmission, AI implementation in the robotic systems. I think this yet to develop. There's probably not a better time to be in than now.
Yeah, that's a good question. Very good question. I don't know if I've got the right answer, but a couple of thoughts maybe. So I work for an aerospace company, I've noticed, and I've always been interested in robotics. And I started out working on robots for space, the space station and things like that. And within the same company, I looked at translating that technology to healthcare. And the key there is, I mean, there's domain knowledge for sure that you need, but understanding, at a basic level about understanding technology and understanding it enough to figure out how to apply it intelligently to solve problems, to do that translation that I'm almost talking about, understanding whatever the problem, whatever domain it's in, whether it's healthcare or it could be nuclear power or wherever robotics are. If we stick with the robotics theme, understanding how to intelligently apply that technology to solve a problem is the skill that I would look for in people graduating. Yeah, it's sometimes difficult in that timeline to go end to end for something, but kind of understanding the how it all works. The reason I mentioned the aerospace thing is in my experience, I've had myself going from aerospace to looking at healthcare, but there's been a lot of translation in the people that I know have gone back and forth between those industries, and it says that there's a lot of translatable skills. And so, what underlies that, it's not necessarily the actual technology you're working on, in kind of the manifestation that you're working on it in your grad, thesis, but it's the methodologies and the processes that you go through when you're doing that. Those are translatable to different industries. Not to say you need to translate industries, but it makes it applicable in a whole bunch of, even within clinical practice. There's all kinds of things that can happen, and just understanding the values that the technology can bring will make you as a graduate valuable. Hope that's helpful.
No, I think definitely. I think these opinions, of course, are not necessarily definitive final answers, but they're actually very helpful in both guiding students. Hopefully all of the students here are taking notes on how to pick problems, what would be useful, and to also give them assurance that what they're doing is not necessarily sort of often, particularly in this space, feels very hard, because I don't see the impact of my work in sort of like my academic lifetime, as in like my academic lifetime during my training, of course. So Aman, as well, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's, I think Tim and I probably both had the same struggle in answering this question, because it is a very difficult, thing with the relatively long development life cycles. And, especially, a company like ours, where, we are looking to bring in people that have experience. And it's that classic catch-22 of like, how do you get the experience if if everybody's looking for that experience, sort of walking in the door. So I think the best answer that we've found, we've been very active in the internship programs, and we've had some pretty good success having really bright young people come in and do really good work, and then come back and join as full-time employees after they graduate. For us, that's probably been the most effective sort of way of working with students. And we've tried working on some capstone projects and that, and with some success, but it's a lot more limited in terms of the scope of it. So it's not sort of that immersive experience that I think the internship programs provide. One thing for the universities, and I think U of T generally does a good job of this, is especially with things like medical technology development or robotics or what have you. The 4-month sort of co-op terms are not enough, and there's so much ramp up time to understand the processes, to there's sort of this quality systems oversight that all of our companies need to adhere to. All of that takes a significant amount of ramp up and overhead. And so, the 4-month terms or even the 8-month terms, I think are pretty short for that. So I really think the 12 to 16-month terms are the most effective for that. And we've seen some pretty good success on that, and had really good contributions from people coming in on those types of programs. And as much as I've just said that the 4-month terms aren't long enough, I do think those are also very useful in terms of getting students exposed to different atmospheres. Tim had talked about moving from aerospace to medical. I'd actually done a co-op term with MDA almost maybe 20 years ago. And so it was part of my development path as well. So I think having exposure to different fields that that have translatable skills is of high value. But it's absolutely a difficult question of these technologies take a very long time to develop. You've got these sort of smaller windows in which you can enter through different programs, and how do you get that all to match? It's a very difficult problem for sure.
I would like to sort of like follow up on this thread. So I'm risking running into the break time, but this is a conversation that you can tell perhaps I'm having too much fun asking questions. Maybe let me ask you a question from a very sort of student's perspective, being a student kind of thing, very recently rather. So this is a problem that appears very often, as Aman pointed out, right? 4 months seems to be too short because the bring up time is actually non-trivial. So what is 1 or 2 skills? Not just, and this is a problem not just in, let's say, people trying to join industry. Actually, this is actually a problem also when students join labs doing particular kinds of projects, right? Maybe what are, and this includes you, Vito, as well. When you are trying to, let's say, start working with collaborators, let's say you said you are working with Sun and Rosalie, and most likely there's a 1 or 2 students involved in that process. What could they learn before they start research in terms of, let's say, technology, or maybe something about anatomy? I remember my time when I was doing this, I was working on particular kinds of like radiation oncology, and I really felt that I needed to go back to school to understand sort of anatomy to do anything meaningful. Because a lot of these students that are here today are actually engineers, what could they learn, like in terms of core skills that would make them sort of hit the ground running in terms of doing research or doing technology development? So if you could sort of point out 1 or 2 things, maybe it could be like, go study anatomy because that's something that is taught to medical students, but never to engineering students, or something like that. Vito, you are muted.
So you don't need to do all the anatomy. It's like almost 1.5 years just for, and half a day per of studies. But I think you need to understand, at least from the the problem that you are trying to solve, the anatomy and the clinical perspective that involves that specialty or that particularly problem. And the first thing we do here is I invite them here to come to the hospital, the students that we've been working together. Or son came multiple times when we were talking about our projects. And the first thing that I like is to bring them to see a procedure, and we discuss the anatomy specifically on that domain. And they have to see the surgical area where the procedure is performed before they visualize everything that they have actually to design. And what I see is a lot when they come and they see the table. Oh, the table is very narrow. I cannot put my prototype here. I have to stay in this side and not in the other side. So I think, and part of the problem solving process has to be knowing the field, knowing where the procedure or the area that you will apply robotics in the hospital is actually being performed. And then if it's a surgery, then knowing the anatomy, that is important. But that can be studied after, once you start this connection with the clinician or with the hospital team that will actually be explaining you the clinical context that you will be trying to help with a robot.
Tim? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. So I'm going to try to maybe generalize. Maybe not the right thing. Vitor, you had some very good kind of, the practices of how you engage someone and bring someone on board and how they get up to speed, and then can start to make contributions faster than maybe otherwise possible. I was an engineering student. Engineers like to be, they're problem solvers. They like to see a problem and try to solve it. The only perspective maybe that I want to share that I've gained over time is, early on in my career, I would look for a solution, and I would try to define a solution right away and jump to that solution. And I think when you move into a place where there is a problem and you're looking to apply technology like robotics, try to avoid jumping right to a solution, like a point in the solution space, and try to take time to understand the problem, the dimensions of the problem, and the characteristics of a solution. And then you can define what a solution might look like. So just trying to follow that process. I know it sounds like maybe you're going slower than, I know what the answer is and I'm gonna, just go there. That's a natural temptation. And I think that's something as over time and over my career that I've tried to keep that perspective. It's not always easy, but that's so when you go into, as an engineer, going into a clinical space and trying to define, understand that problem, that the interaction that you were talking about, observing what goes on, asking about, anatomy and what's going on in your mind, and doing that translation that Aman was talking about earlier, that's so difficult to do. Understanding and being able to do that process is really valuable. So that's a skill maybe to work on.
I fully agree. I fully agree. And I will encourage the students to develop this process of interviewing, of getting that right. We in medicine, we have many problems. We are specialists on creating and studying problems, and we don't have necessarily a solution. So I understand your perspective that you think already, I need a solution and I need to get there. In medicine, we have problems that we will never find a solution, or we will have partial solutions along the time. And that is a good understanding for an engineer that will be dealing with a problem, because he may not find a complete solution, but there will be partial solutions over time. Maybe philosophical, but that's some, yeah. We don't have a solution for most of the problems we see in medicine.
That's an interesting perspective. Yeah. It's comforting, actually, in some ways.
So we have many questions today from the audience. We may not be able to get to many questions today, but I do want to sort of ask one question as we close this session. But I would want so the one interesting question that came to us from, I don't know if I'm saying the name correctly, Puyuan. The question goes something like along the lines of, how does a grad student think about creating, let's say, a technological startup in this space, especially with respect to two challenges? And I'm adding my own spice to the question. One, long technological development cycle. So creating startups in this kind of space may be trickier. And two, where they may exist mature companies with deeper pockets. So how does one go about that? And I think that's a very sort of hard question to answer. So I will not sort of put any of you on spot, but feel free to answer whoever wants to.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, having gone through some of that, I don't think there's unfortunately an easy answer, and it's really about just immersing yourself in it. And from prototyping, when we were developing the early prototypes for Canavi, or what at the time was Calibri Technologies, our current CEO and myself, who are the two primary co-founders, we were literally spending evenings and weekends in his parents' basement, building prototypes, or we were writing patents, or we were applying for proof of principle grants, and those types of things. It is a lot of legwork. It is speaking to whatever mentors you have in your network, or developing mentors in your network, working with the innovation support groups within the university, and getting whatever guidance you can from the mentors that are available to you, but also, unfortunately, just putting in the work. There's no easy answer. You really just have to immerse yourself in it.
One thing, and Aman, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this one too. I was kind of, as developers of technology, I always thought that was the thing, and I was kind of humbled at some point when going to investors to enable your company, that you get the first questions aren't necessarily about the details of the technology. So, let's put that to one side. Of course it's important, and technology has to be there and work and stuff like that, but it's not the end of it. And it's actually not where, if you're thinking about investment anyway, it's not generally where the conversation starts, or it very quickly goes to, okay, what is the stakeholders, what is their the value proposition to the patient, to the healthcare provider, whether it's a hospital administrator or an insurance provider, is there reimbursement? All these kind of questions that they're not as sexy maybe, but in terms of technology, but they come up very quickly. And yeah, you put a lot of hard work in developing technology, and then you're I don't know, part of your brain thinks that well, that's it, aren't you? It's obviously has a benefit, and there's more to it apparently.
No, you are 100% correct about that, right? Like if you get into a room, either presenting to, there's a number of competitions or things like that where, for startups or for just, communities of investors that come to see what's sort of out there. One of the first questions you'll always be asked is, who's going to pay for this, right? Like, why would anybody pay for this? What is your reimbursement strategy? Like they'll you should expect to know everything about the DRG codes associated with the procedure that you're potentially influencing. Like, is it reimbursed? What's the pathway for that? What's the regulatory pathway? What does your proof of outcomes look like? What's the literature say about these types of things? It's so much more than having the technology. Like you said, that's almost it's not a given, because it's a very difficult part of it. And that's it requires real sort of ingenuity and innovation, but it is only a part of it. And you will very quickly, very quickly be asked about all the other aspects of it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I don't want to diminish that, but it's kind of like table stakes. You don't get into the room without that, but then, like you say, then you have to deal with all the next level of questions.
That's wonderful. I think this has been a wonderful freewheeling sort of discussion. I have personally enjoyed this very much. I would like to thank all three of our panelists, Vitor, team, and Aman, for being such good sports about fielding questions that were sort of, I would argue, left afield. But that said, I would like to also thank all of the organizers for this session, and we have a wonderful program ahead of us in the next sessions. I would like to invite all three of you to attend the Q&A and the networking session this afternoon at 12 to 1, if your time and schedule permits, of course. Hopefully some of our students and other members of the community would like to ask you more sort of open-ended questions about topics that we discussed today. So it'll be lovely to have you there as well. And thank you again. Thanks, Rosalie, and I believe over to Kimberly for the next part of the schedule.
Yes, thank you so much. Dylan, thank you so much, panelists. Dylan, if you want to go ahead and put up the break slide, we'll go ahead and just take a quick 2-minute break so that everyone gets a little bio action in there. And our next panelists, Rosalie, Ron, and Milad are ready to go. So we'll start back here at 10:45. Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
To our panel, that Rosalie Wang will be leading. Rosalie, Ron, and Milad, if you wanted to go ahead and turn your videos on now. Oh, and I saw Milad. He was here just a second ago.
Yeah, it won't allow me to turn my video on.
Ah, okay, great. Wonderful. And so I will go ahead and pass the baton to Rosalie. Rosalie, take it away.
Okay, so have we got everybody here?
Yeah.
All right,
I
good.
have it.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so we have 69 people on. That is fantastic. So I don't know what some of the other folks in the previous panel were talking about Zoom meetings being boring. I'm finding this meeting this morning absolutely riveting, and I don't know about everybody else, but it feels like that conversation that Animesh led could have gone on for days. Some of the questions that he had posed and the responses were just really interesting, in the sense that there's a lot that we can really explore in this field. And so yeah, I'm finding it absolutely, yeah, riveting is one word. So a wonderful way to start a week off. So I actually need to do a bit of a disclaimer. Sun had mentioned that I'm with Toronto Rehab. Yes, I am. I'm an affiliate scientist there, but I do need to acknowledge who actually pays my bills. So I'm actually faculty at the University of Toronto in the Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy Department. And while I do have close associations with Toronto Rehab, I do have to make that update. So it is my absolute great pleasure to be here leading this second panel, looking at how healthcare robotics can be used to support independent living and therapeutic goals of patients. And with this panel, similar to the panel that Animesh led just now, it's going to be kind of freewheeling. So we'll have, we're going to go with the flow of the conversation. We will have, I've got some questions set up, but I also do want to reserve some time for the audience to ask some questions as well. And because there's only 2 panelists here, I would just like to also offer that the panelists can ask each other questions as well as they come up. So I'm just going to start off with a very brief introduction of who we've got in our panel here. So first off, we have Ron Bellino, who is an advocate and a caregiver. So he's waving his hand. Excellent. And so Ron is also newly minted as a HWell Honorary Fellow for 2020. And so it's a great honor to have him be a part of our panel today. He is an active advocate for dementia, caregiving, aging, and research. And he was also a caregiver for his father, who lived with Alzheimer's disease for over 10 years. And supporting him and his goal to age in place. And so Ron has, in his support of his family, used technology, leveraged the community, and made access to research that was available to support his family and his father in particular to live as best as he possibly can. And Ron has done lots and lots of presentations in different university courses, but also in lots of different spheres in research around the world related to Alzheimer's disease. Also with areas around community support, policing as well, and supporting people to live as safely as possible with dementia. And of course, he's a caregiver, and so he's a big advocate for caregivers as well. Next up, we have Milad Azadeh Megrazi. I'm sorry. Hopefully Milad will correct me in my horrible pronunciation. Milad is the Vice President of Research Development and Partner Integration at Myant Inc. And so a really, really awesome company that is based out of Ontario here. And Milad is a U of T alumnus. And so he graduated with a Bachelor of Applied Science and a Master's of Applied Science in Mechanical Engineering and the Institute of Biomaterials and Biomedical Engineering. He worked as a research engineer at Toronto Rehabilitation Institute, where he collaborated with physicians and therapists and other researchers looking at primarily neuromuscular and skeletal issues after spinal cord injury, and also with patients who've had a stroke. And so right now he oversees the research and development efforts at Myant, and his vision in his role is to continue this path and make accessible technologies that are able to spread from academia through to research and to everyday use. So without further ado, I'm going to present my first question, which will also give you an opportunity to get to know our panelists in their own voices. So the first question I'd like to ask is, how is robotics a part of your daily life or work? And what thrills you about your work in this field? So maybe let's start off with Ron.
Okay. So hi, everyone, and thank you, Rosalie, for the introduction. Thanks as well to you and Kimberly for inviting me here today. Hopefully, many of you have Zoom set up so you could see our full faces, okay? Because I know you guys were talking about how Zoom could be boring. I'm gonna change it up a little bit here. I'm actually gonna add a little bit of technology here. Can you see that beside me on my screen? Okay, yeah. So I'm gonna be showing a little bit of a history here because Rosalie already gave us a couple of warm-up questions ahead of time. So I kind of was able to prepare. And I have to usually start with the story of how I got into robotics, or just my interest in robotics. Because years ago, my first robot was back when my grandma gave it to me back in the Philippines. And it was called the Voltus 5, okay? That's what it is right there, okay? My first concept of a robot, it was when I was visiting in the Philippines, and I was about maybe 6 years old, and just fell in love with that robot. Now, I'm speaking to all of you coming from the perspective of someone that's not in engineering, that's not around robots the way you're around it, okay? But I also come from a little bit of an engineering background, but that's not the hat I'm wearing. I'm coming from what I believe the community, okay, the general audience that are patients and caregivers in the home might be thinking what robots are, okay? So this was my first robot, okay? After that, I got this thing called the Omnibot, okay? Some of you might know about it, but it was my very first robot that was in the home that could move around, okay? And the Omnibot actually operated with a tape cassette, okay? That's how the data was stored many years ago. If anyone had a VIC-20 or those kind of things. It would be on a tape cassette. And the Omnibot was what I got excited about in the home. Okay, so I would wake up on a Saturday morning. You could program it, and I could say, "Good morning, Omnibot." It didn't talk back yet, and it would go all the way. I could press a button, and I programmed it to go from my bedroom to the kitchen. Okay, so they could get my breakfast. Okay, but then I'd have to yell to my mom to kind of put the cereal there. But if she wasn't there, I would have to go to the kitchen, open the fridge, get the milk, pour the cereal, go back to my room, and then have the Omnibot come back to me. Okay, that was how it was years ago. Okay, with just technology in the home. Eventually, robots, we became, started becoming popular in media with the Transformers. Okay, you see there, you see Bumblebee there. And actually, I'm just showing off here. I have the first edition of the Transformers comics. That's how nerdy I am here. Okay, so that's just something I need to let you know there that this is how I learned about robots, reading about it. C3PO, R2D2, those are some of the robots. Then robots started turning bad. Okay, so our concept that people are afraid. Some people are afraid with technology. So you know who that is, the Terminator. We have from the Borg, okay, that's Jean-Luc Picard there. But, who knows? Right now, are there robots around us? Could be, they could be living amongst us. We don't know, they could be. But for me, in the end, when it comes to what we're talking about today in the home, okay, it's not all that stuff I just talked about. For me, robots is simply the tools that help us get through life, okay? And that could simply be, okay, a dishwasher, okay? That could be a washing machine, okay? A laundry machine, okay? They don't have eyes, they don't move, but they have robotic features, okay, that help us with something that Chaitali typed in earlier, activities of daily living, okay? We'll talk about that a little bit more later, I'm sure. And a toaster oven with a rotisserie, okay? Something like that. Instead of someone turning it, all the time, that's to me, some form of robotic tool. A fan is a robotic tool, helps keep someone cool, okay? That's important in healthcare. So these are just some of the things that I'm looking at. And one last thing we use at my home, for my dad, we had a Hoyer lift, or an assisted lift, a patient lift, okay? So that to me is also considered a robot type tool. So that's how I look at robotics in my life, and that's kind of just the warm up there, Rosalie. A little history there of me there. Okay?
Excellent. Some excellent everyday examples. Fantastic. Milad?
Yeah. So thank you, everyone, for the invitation. So I guess my exposure to robots and robotics comes from the background as a mechanical engineer. I was always fascinated by, these systems. And as I got into, a bit more of biomedical engineering, the interest of kind of interfacing robots with humans was pretty, fascinating. You had all those cartoons when you were a kid, you were watching them and you're like, well, what if this could be real? And you saw some real life examples of it. And then the practicality of it came into question. Okay, well, what is truly practical? And when you think of, well, why haven't robotics and robots picked up as well in a kind of a metamorphosis of a human robot complex? It's because they're not designed for humans. They're designed for robots. They're designed to be robots. We can do quite complex, movements and dynamics, as you've probably seen with, entities like Boston Dynamics, but that's never been translated to humans, people with disabilities that might need a much more, simpler version of that to be able to, for example, stand up. You move their arms and do simple tasks such as scratching your nose, which we might take for granted on a daily basis. So now that I kind of got into that area of interest and I got exposed to it. And some of the work that we do at the company I work at, Myant, which involves around textiles, you might wonder, well, how do these two interfaces, kind of robotics and assistive devices and textiles, come into the equation? Well, the textile is the lining of many of these robotics and how it can connect with the body to capture signals, capture movements. Maybe it's an EMG signal that you wish to use to elicit the movement and have it assisted. Maybe you need to capture pressure points on the body to prevent pressure ulcers and other further damage that the the movement of the robot will be exerting on the body of the user. And I guess the most advanced kind of research and technology I've seen in this area with kind of robots and humans outside of the system has been in Japan, where they're even putting tactile sensors in the robots to understand how much pressure, how much force, how much heat, even that touch of a human versus a robot can be translated and adjusted. So it's a very fascinating world. I think there's a lot to come with the advancement of robotics and the need for a more all-encompassing healthcare system that's not limited to the brick and mortar of a healthcare facility, but people would be able to receive it at home and be empowered to take control of their own healthcare and not always be dependent. So that's kind of where I feel robotics can play a huge role, and it's going to probably boom in the coming years.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, lots and lots of great descriptions around how the interface of humans and technology can be made. So really interesting. We can dive a little bit deeper into that later as well. I sort of see this panel as being sort of the discussion of opportunities in the sense that in the previous panel there was a discussion around sort of the systemic issues that are happening now with related to adoption, but this we're really going to be focusing on end users, and that could be individuals who are consumers, people who have disabilities, older people, people with various healthcare conditions, caregivers, and healthcare providers. So with that context, just reflecting on your experiences personally and professionally, can you give us some examples of ways in which robotics has made a difference in the health or social care of people with health or with health problems or disabilities? Ron?
Yeah, so I'll go first, sir. So the one thing is to understand first and foremost. Sometimes I like to work backwards, right? To understand what is the goal. Some of you may want to take a look at the perspective of begin with the end in mind. So Stephen Covey, okay, it's begin with the end in mind and reverse engineer it. Okay, so many of you here as students, I think there's a good portion have an engineering background. Reverse engineer it. Okay, some go the other way. You got to go both ways. But if you don't even understand the end piece, that's a big deal. So I'm going to pick, in my world, it happened to be dementia and Alzheimer's. Okay, and some of that, we're dealing with social isolation. We're dealing with communication challenges. So right now, you're seeing me. Okay, if you see me on full screen, but if you see closely, there is a robot right here beside me. Okay, and I actually don't have the batteries for it. Okay, they died on me, so they're double D batteries for them. Didn't test it out before I was going to bring some, but this was gifted to me by Baycrest after I did a presentation. And really all it is a robotic cat. Okay, but what this does to many individuals further along, okay, in their dementia. This is not for everybody. You don't just say someone with dementia, this is for you. People with dementia, they come from many different lifestyles, different challenges, but there's some that will benefit from something like this, okay? And that ability to have a robotic cat, okay, to feel, okay, that moves around, it meows, it's very lifelike, okay, has done very well. And even one of my neighbors here that I gave it to them in my condo here, help the caregiver, okay, have respite for, like he said, for about 2 to 3 hours a day. He could just leave his wife there and not always have to stress, okay, over her just fidgeting and all that. So that is an example. There is one that I'm going to send you a link here that I have here. One thing I like to talk about when it comes to some of these technologies is how do you get something from point A to point B is what many of us try to figure out, okay? But sometimes it's how do you get something from point B to point A, okay? And for example, there's a cabinet company that's here in Ontario that I've just been chatting with that brings the cabinets towards someone. So someone who may be in a wheelchair, someone who may not be able to access something high, or someone that still can access something high, but may need to go on like steps, okay, one of those stools, puts that person at risk, right? So to me, that's still a robotic system. So I'll put the links here to some of that, but those are some of the examples of how I look at it. You know, the physical, a lot of this is physically related, okay? To me, robotics is something that there's some kind of physical system that is impacting someone's life. So to me, I'm throwing an example of a cat, and I'm throwing some physical furniture that I'll put in the link here in a second.
Mhm. So, I mean, I think that the example of the robotic cat is a fantastic example. It just really illustrates that it actually is supporting the goals of both the person living with dementia and the caregiver. You mentioned respite, which is so critically important for somebody who's providing essentially 24-hour care to somebody. And potentially with a robotic cat, we all, have a sense of, pets and what they can mean to people, and, the comfort of having a something like a robotic cat around with the sort of tactile and the sensory experiences really can help to contribute to a feeling of calm, which often could be an issue in terms of high anxiety and agitation in some circumstances as well. So I think that, the potential of something like that is fantastic.
Yeah. Now, just with what Milad's working on, the tactile pieces, like combining that, with some of these, is just, that's the beauty of what's possible, right? So the work he's doing could be like quite robotic, as you said, Milad, like, robots are robots and all that stuff. But how do we make it soft so it doesn't feel like it's a robot, okay? That it's something that someone can accept. That is the tricky part. It's doable, it's just a question of how can we do that.
So we're going to shift over to Milad, thinking about how robotics could help make a difference in people's lives with health or disabilities, health issues or disabilities.
Sure. I think I'll touch up on maybe just adding to that point, the physiological benefits that some robots can provide and the psychological implications of the robots as well is very important. A good example of this, again, I was mentioning assistive devices for standing, for example, and they never really picked up. You have standing frames, for example, but a robot version of that is not necessarily there yet. There are examples of it, but this has been implemented quite readily in factories, automotive manufacturing plants, where they use it to reduce basically the burden on the lower back and assist to stand, which is great. And you see, it providing a lot of benefit. They're looking at these applications in military, in soft exoskeletons now. It's becoming a kind of a concept, whether it's electronic consideration of a robotic, or some of them are even materials-based. Material response and provides a certain assistance to the user. The other key thing is the adoption of these by individuals that might have a disability is critical. In many of the discussions that we've had, the users don't want to have something that will make them stand out even further, for example. And many of these robotic systems are quite bulky, and they some might consider it cool, but it's not for for us as sides. It's the user, the end user, and how they perceive it and how they would adopt it, and that consideration really does play a role in we can potentially make a robot that will work for the individual and it will be perfect by our view as an engineer, and it will do everything without error. But at the end of the day, when you put it in front of the user, a lot of those considerations for them to adopt it might not have been in there. So I think in the design process, it's very important to, as you fact check and as you constantly iterate on your engineering design plan and how you envision the robot functioning, but also look at the use implications of it and how the users might digest it and adopt it. Because ultimately, many of these areas are quite niche. And it's important to be, to limit iterations in the sense of, not being so broad and allowing the user to dictate where the direction is rather than what the internal kind of thoughts about it are.
So, Milad, you've touched on several points that might be related to the second or the next question as well, but absolutely fine. I think that's fantastic. Some really, really great examples there. And I think just, going back to Ron's point and also with Milad's point with sort of physical mobility kinds of concerns with, the making the environment accessible. So the example with the cabinets and also with the mobility aids, just looking at the opportunities and possibilities that robotics can have in terms of making both the environment easily accessible for somebody who may have some mobility issues, but also to physically facilitate their mobility within that environment. And so I think there's, yeah, in terms of what possibilities there could be with robotics for creating more independence or assisting with independence, I think it's those are some really excellent examples. So I'm going to shift into the next question, is looking at so when we're looking at applications for robotics in health and social care, understanding the needs and preferences and the goals and environments of our users, consumers, or however you want to call them, is absolutely critical. And Milad had touched on some of these mechanisms already, but can you describe some of the strategies that you or your organizations use to find out information about users or customers that you can use to best create solutions for them? And so I'll start with Ron.
Okay. So this actually relates to, I just saw a comment from Katie there, and she's commenting, it seems that engineers do not spend much time having discussions with end users, right? It's great to hear that, we're passionate about this. So, one of the things I talk about is, yes, simply having that conversation. That's the start, okay? And Milad was just talking about that. You have to understand the end users, and part of that means getting them to the table, okay? Bringing them to the table, inviting them to the table is one of the things I always talk about, but that's me. It's a question of you as engineers, as students, to have them at the table, but also have other players at the table, okay? Don't just have engineer. And I'm just picking on that crowd because I also have coming from that engineering background, but engineer, healthcare worker or healthcare provider, okay? The community provider, okay? The patient, the caregiver, they should be at the table, okay? Throughout here and there. So you have to have that mix, okay? But so one thing I want to throw out, one of the strategies I talk about are and this doesn't apply just to the word I'm going to use here. I talk about the calculating caregiver, okay? But this is also the calculating patient or the person we're caring for. And I talk about that all of us are calculating, okay? If you're going to give us a technology, okay, a solution, okay, we're calculating what is the return for us, okay? What's in it for us, okay? What am I going to get out of this, okay? And okay, it's not just something that's, has lights and whistles, and looks fancy, that cool, okay? That's not what we're looking for always, okay? So to understand that calculating, and I'm going to use the term caregiver here, that's the crowd I'm talking about, the calculating caregiver, and we actually consider their ROs, the returns, the return on, okay? And if this crowd, it's a very bright crowd listening here, okay? You do your math, okay? I call it the return on the numbers, okay? And what are some of the return ons, okay? So big one is the ROI. Many of you guys know what that is, the return on investment, okay? But what are the other numbers? Return on T, return on time is another big one, okay? But there's many more, okay? There's return on, let's say, someone's emotion, okay? Return on their physical health, return on their quality of life, okay? It's not always about quantity of life, okay? It might be, okay? So ROQL, return on your value. So that was discussed earlier as well in the previous session, okay? To justify the values of, what you're giving, the MVP, what's the minimal viable product, or the, but what's of value to that person? So all these ROs, it's tricky because there is no one algorithm. It's different for every patient and every family and every caregiver you're going to be dealing with, okay? So, but they're all numbers, okay? Some go up, some go down. Just so happens, if you ever forget this, so the return on the numbers actually spells out Ron, okay? So that's just, I just use that here and there. Just have it, and that wasn't planned. It's just return on the numbers. Say, I'll stick that in there, okay? So what are the RONs for who you're serving, okay? So that's what I threw out to people, is to understand the RONs and what they're calculating. And to figure that out, you have to have a conversation with them, or you have to pull them in. Okay. And the only one other point I'll talk quickly, I'll sneak this in here, Rosalie. Study psychographics. Okay. A lot of people don't know what that is, but I would suggest you look up psychographics, which talks about the values, opinions, beliefs. Okay. It's not simply this cross off a check mark that, okay, dad was changed. This helps dad change. This helps dad put food on his table. It's not just that. There's more to that. You know, what are the values? What kind of food is it? Okay. Is it something that he appreciates? Is it a cultural, dish that he would, want? So look up psychographics. And my last comment here is I talk about failure. Okay. I always look at the failure point. Many people look at all the cool stuff. This can do this and that. I say, where is it going to fail? Okay. What part does it fail in the hands of myself, in the journey, okay, in the path of getting to me, okay, in policy, all that stuff you need to understand. For me, I have an acronym that I use for fail. It's whenever there's a failure point, it's an opportunity to find another important lesson, okay? So I'm always looking for that, okay? If you can answer all my failure questions, then that's a good product and solution you probably have at that point, okay? But those are some of the ways I approach this.
So that sounds really, really interesting. Thank you for all of the tips and strategies. And for anybody who's thinking about, a very holistic approach to understanding who end users are, consumers, think about Ron. All right, Milad.
Yeah. I'll just double down on what Ron was just describing, and to take a kind of a chapter out of industry and in a specific market research. This concept of psychographics and understanding the customer, it's amazing to see how marketing is using this at length to figure out if the color of the packaging should be green or purple and what is the return on how much they can sell. But these concepts are not necessarily implemented in someone's quality of life in the products that are necessarily being developed. So using concepts like this, conjoint analysis at the early stages of the development is critical. And the application that's coming out of this is going to be a very multidisciplinary effort to get to that point. And for that, the engagement needs to be systematically across the board and everything maturing together, where you don't go too deep into the engineering developments and you need to go back and reinvent everything and redesign everything. So we have this concept of obviously technology readiness level, which I think everyone is aware of, but actually employing that in practice is very key. And you can have a similar concept of technology readiness for the product that you're developing. How is this product going to be perceived? How is the user going to interact with it? What is the return on investment, or all the other numbers that you're looking at, all the aspects and the considerations, and what are the different, the spectrum of the individuals that will be using this. So as an individual that's going into building, let's say, the next big startup for robotics, the shimmer of a shiny startup that's coming out of San Francisco, in and out strategy is not a sustainable, for the user, for the end user. So it's a bit more valuable if it would be a more organic and well-founded base to build from, because then in itself it will grow and it will bring out all the other possibilities that can be realized. So yeah, I think just a comprehensive overview of the development cycle and figuring out what are the areas that need to be focused on. So then at that point, you can figure out that ROI, what amount of technology, funding, and time does it need to go through, and where is the lowest hanging fruit per se to get, the first product out. And that should be the key thing, to get the first unit out for testing, for validation, because at that point, then you start learning where all our assumptions correct or wrong. So spending too much time in the early TRLs, this concept, that concept, at a certain point you need to cut and say, okay, this is what we're going with. So that's just kind of my input on the development of these robotic technologies.
Rosalie, can I ask Milad a question?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm loving where you're going there, Milad, because I also love the lowest hanging fruit. If you don't understand the lowest hanging fruit, okay, I don't know who you're solving for, then you really don't understand. But all the stuff that you just shared, and there's a lot of students here, okay? When did you learn this? Okay, like, like this is the, like, did you learn this after schooling, during schooling? Like, because here they are at school. Are they going to hear this, or do you have to experience it? I'm just curious when you really got it.
For me, it was honestly a matter of experience. And the thing is, you get exposed to a lot of these concepts here and there, and you hear it here, you hear it there, and you're like, well so what? And so what to the beauty where you don't, I couldn't grasp how is this applicable, or how can I use this and apply it in daily practice. But as you gain experience and you go deeper into the developments, you realize that these concepts give a framework, where the whole thing won't be a house of cards and just falling on itself with one piece of the equation fails. At least there's that framework where you can, it's kind of like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? You're not going to go lower than that. You already have a strong base and foundation to build from. So you're reducing your risk, and it's a risk mitigation strategy, and aiming for success. I guess in university, you're always waiting for deadline day to hand it in and just to get the grade and go out. But in practice, that deadline day is the next iteration and the next, and you ultimately have to have a solution for the user. So it becomes, truly application, applied science, where the application is the key. And that's kind of where, I kind of had to employ them on a daily basis.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, no, the applied part is challenging if you're not part of that, if you're still that student going through it. Okay, yeah. But if you really hear clearly from what Milad is saying, what I'm sharing, and others are sharing, we are talking to you about failures in a different way, and hopefully your failures, are not as big, okay, or not as many, but you will have them. Just be aware, you're going to have them. We're all going to have it. Just can it be much smaller? That's the goal. Thanks, Rosalie.
Yeah, so this is fantastic. So what I'm hearing is that I think there's a lot of sort of differences in how potentially work in academia is operating, and work in industry in real life. And real life, I mean industry, but also in the real life sort of care settings, where people who are living with disabilities or have health problems, and the caregivers providing that support for them. There's often, potentially a mismatch in what happens in academia, where we spend a lot of time trying to work out a lot of details about our intervention, but once it sort of gets into a real life setting, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, lots of sort of revision, updating. Maybe your initial course was just way off base, and once you get the feedback from the other stakeholders, including people in industry, what potentially could be a marketable product or a sellable product, really, goes back into the fold, and lots of iterations sort of need to be made. We can call them, failures, but we can, again, as Ron said, potentially opportunities to improve and improve and improve. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and just, in a, one sentence or two sentences, let me know what you think are the grand challenges in the application of robotics for health or social care.
Okay, I'll go first. Okay,
yeah.
So one or two. For me, it's about knowledge translation and knowledge mobilization piece. Okay, going specifically, usually from academia and research, okay, to the real world. Okay, that I believe there's a gap of how you could communicate that better. So that's probably the big one I'm thinking of. And I'm actually giving a solution as well. I also believe that there has to be some kind of cross-pollinating of different disciplines, like having an occupational therapist, okay, understand technology, okay, like technology, solving for technology, okay, just putting that crowd together as an example. So that's, I went over 2 sentences, but.
That's okay. That's okay. All right, go ahead, Milad.
Yeah, you took them away from me. I was going to say knowledge translation as well, which is key. And obviously multidisciplinary, that's another key thing, in engineering departments, your department of mechanical engineering, department of electrical engineering, doesn't show not even interdepartmental in engineering, but outside, like you said, with working with clinicians, working with people that interact with the patients on a daily basis, or even working with different modalities of manufacturing and that knowledge. But I suppose, just to add my one word after all that sentence too, it's adoption. Knowledge translation is key, and that's kind of one thing that would be huge if academia can ramp it up and allow these ideas that are brewing from the universities to come out. But then how can we get them adopted? And that adoption in itself forces us to think for quality of life improvements for the end user. So yeah, for me, it would be adoption.
Rosie, I need to do a plug here for someone in the chat here, okay? And that's Chaitali. I mentioned her name earlier, okay?
Yes.
So Chaitali actually is part of AgeWell. So I co-chair AgeWell's Older Adult and Caregiver Advisory Committee. And Chaitali has an engineering background, works in healthcare, and also, was a caregiver to her mom, okay? So wearing all those hats, okay, that's gold, in my opinion, right? So sometimes finding those that are in your discipline, but also are living it, okay? That's where they'll be able to understand at a very different level, okay? So that I just wanted to throw in Chaital because she's sharing her story here. And there's many out there. They just, they're in your class. They're your neighbors. They work with you, right? So just pulling out that story. So thanks, Chaitali. I had to put that in there because it's related to what we're talking about. Like she can help with that knowledge translation, mobilization, that adoption piece. She knows the words from both sides, the language, the pain points.
Yes, I appreciate Chaitali very much. She's also volunteering with our lab. So
oh, is she? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, brilliant. All right, so I'm really pleased that there's so much convergence in the sort of the grand challenges that you've presented. So looking at knowledge translation and absolute critical areas, and also the interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, however you would like to frame it, the degree of integration of all of the disciplines, and also sectors as well. So academia and industry and advocacy. All of that is all of those disciplines and sectors are really critical to being able to actually transition some of the development in robotics into actual real life applications and for adoption. So yeah, really interesting. So I've got the final question here before we sort of open it up to the audience for some additional questions, and I'll have a look at the chat as well. What do you think are the greatest opportunities right now? And so what should we really be focusing on right now to benefit people with health problems or disabilities? Like if we miss this opportunity now, there potentially could be great detriments. So Ron, what do you think?
Okay, so now I've always gone first before Milad. I wasn't sure if you want him to go first. Okay, I'll go. So for me, it was talked about a little bit earlier about the remote piece. I'm interested in telepresent robots or telepresent kind of technologies or remote technologies. I was doing that even 8-9 years ago with my dad, caring remotely. So what could that be? It doesn't have to be that robot, that's like an android that has a face, as I said. It could be, stuff that Milad's doing, but remote. Okay, that ability that I could get the results remotely. I'd love VR or some kind of augmented reality where I could help with the robot make a meal for my dad. Okay, if no one is around, or open the fridge, or something remotely that I could do that. Okay, it's there. It's just passing it on in the care space. Since I got this moment here, I just say if anyone's doing work in that around the kitchen or the bathroom, that's if we're talking about in the home. Those are the two toughest places, okay, to care for the most part, in my opinion. Okay, so many failure points in those places. If you're doing anything in that space, give me a shout because I'm always trying to find solutions around that, especially remote as well. So that's where I'd be, putting my interest in. Yeah.
Okay, telepresence robots, excellent. Okay, Milad.
And I think it's in the same light. The opportunity that's presented to us right now, especially with the pandemic, is remote healthcare. As a whole, and robotics plays one piece of the puzzle, but the ability to provide healthcare in an equitable, efficient manner, not just locally but globally, has become ever more needed as a result of the pandemic. And some of the work that we're doing at my end through textiles, because everyone wears clothing, is allowing for this to happen. So being able to create this.
Oh, Milad muted yourself.
Sorry. Yeah, this concept has been kind of presented again. I go back to the Japanese model. It's a concept called Society 5.0, where we have a lot of connectivity. And now with 5G and the immense ability to transfer and send data in real time, so things can be effectual in real time, not just sending data and saying, hey, you have a Fitbit, you look at the data, so what? What is the point of that? But to have meaningful and actionable outcomes for the user and enabling the users to have that, as well as with that data stream being present, anyone remotely can tap in and support their parents, their grandparents, or loved one, wherever they have around the world. That is a huge opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to it because that will really shift a lot of the plays in society. I was listening to just a documentary on the weekend on CBC talking about individuals with disabilities, how ever since COVID, their surgeries have been delayed, and they just look at the age. They don't look at the consideration of disability and how that affects their quality of life. And in that period, there is no monitoring, there is no support above and beyond what they need. So, and these systems and the technologies are there. If it's there for you to turn on your lamps remotely or to, play a TV show, what it is, again, the implications of it for improvements in quality of life are definitely much grander. The ROI is definitely bigger. So we need to play an active role in pushing those. It might not seem, sexy by venture capitalists, but once they see the dollars and cents when it goes to insurance and healthcare funding, then a slew of the money will come. So we just need to make it that translation of technology more viable and realizable for all the funds to switch into this field.
Rosemary, I just want to back up, Milad, just on the diversity, the equity piece. Like, yeah, that is huge with technology because there's a concern of the digital divide, okay, the haves and the have-nots, especially now. And the only other thing to add is for people, if you're interested, is some of you in our space know the social determinants of health. Okay, that's a piece, but the digital determinants of health is becoming a bigger piece. That if you don't have access to technology, that could affect your health. That's just something to be aware of. My last ask, Rosalie, just if anyone's doing work back in the kitchen that gets food from the freezer to the oven to the person, that's the one I'm hitting up a lot of walls recently. Okay, from family. So I'm just throwing that out to this crowd. Okay?
So anybody, students who want to work on a new project, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I wanted actually to say thank you to Milad for raising the issue of equity, because whenever we are talking about technology, we always have questions of who's paying for it, who will have access, does it increase the divide between people who are able to afford technologies and people who are needing to live without the benefits of potential technologies. So very, very critical questions when we think about adoption and translation, thinking about, the piece around how do we make things so that they're accessible for people, but also having policies that would support access and don't create unnecessary barriers for people to maximally benefit. So excellent. We've got quite a few comments in the chat, which is fantastic. Keep the chat comments coming. I'm going to scan for some questions.
And while you're doing that, Rosie, I need to do one more comment that we haven't talked about. It's just the trust around technology. Okay, there is that piece that you also have to build the trust for, like that we don't trust technology. Okay, or many. Okay, I'm an early adopter to many, but that trust, the privacy piece. Okay, where's the data going? Who's holding it? We didn't discuss that today, but that is just something to keep in mind as well with your technologies.
Absolutely. So there's some great discussion here about caregiving with robots. Okay, so, and some kudos for interdisciplinarity. All right.
See some questions from Aaron. You saw that?
Yes. So Aaron. Okay. Okay, okay, so a question from Erin. Clinical studies with new technologies often suffer from not being able to recruit enough participants to get significant results. Have you found some techniques to create barrier-free recruitment through the technology design process? In particular, are there some techniques you use to probe users for insight on their needs before having a functional prototype? And then there's another question after that, but let's have a look at that first. And Ron and Milad, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I'll maybe jump in on this. Um, this is a very, I guess, focused question on basically how do you make it happen. And to that point, there obviously is a need for well, there's a necessity of having an ethics disclosure or ethics board clearance when you want to do a study. I suppose for some of the initial assessments of what the user needs, you don't need a broad disclosure or ethics document. You can have a very simplistic one where you're just assessing their needs and having interviews with them. So focus groups or just regular surveys, you can send those out. Best piece of kind of information, is a literature review. If you have those documents that have all the previous studies, you can find a big chunk of the data there. But the other key thing is, as you're developing these technologies, you have to have one eye, and no one tells you this in school or anywhere, on what are the regulations. What is the class 1? What is the class 2? What is the class 3? What is the need for developing a class 1, 2, or 3 device? How is the development cycle and how is the documentation that you needed? And it's kind of, when you reach a certain point and you're not aware of this, then you look at it, then you thought you're over the hill, and then you realize, oh my God, there's another massive mountain ahead, which is regulatory. And it is very tedious, and backfilling of these documents is definitely not advised, but at that point you would have to do it, which is you will go in a spiral. So understanding where you fall on the regulatory claim, and deciding your strategy based off of that. For example, you're mentioning electric stimulation. Is this electric stimulation a device which is going to be something that the individual's life depends on it? Or is it something that's assistive and their life doesn't depend on it? The class 2 and class 3 variation is huge in the amount of work and the validations that you would need to take. So as much as I hate to say it, the technology translation is dead on arrival, or right off the bat when you want to get into it if you're going for class 3. You have to phase things in. And second, looking at predicate devices. What has been there before previously, so you can build off of that foundation. Those could really assist and support, because there is a fair bit of information previously done, and that's kind of what we kind of conveniently use the word technology translation, because we're not trying to create something from scratch. But in the process of translating technology, you will come up with new opportunities, and from that foundation that you've translated, you can introduce the new technologies.
So just a quick question for the HeRo curriculum developers out there. Is there content for the students related to regulatory processes in the curriculum? Or might that be something we need to embed? Just asking out into the Zoom world out there. Anyway, anybody has a response, they can put it in the chat. Ron, you had a comment.
Yeah, on this, on Aaron's comment, I interpret the question as recruitment, okay? Recruitment of participants earlier on. My answer, pay them, give them money. That's the obvious answer, okay? If you give something to someone that they'll say, okay, I'm gonna show up, here you go, here's $1,000 to show up, they'll come, okay? But that's probably not the route we're going, okay? But I'm just giving you my quick smart ass answer that I'm giving you. But right now, I'm going to let you know, recruitment is tough in every area, okay? And to make it around, especially with COVID, okay, technically those that you have to access, if you're recruiting patients and caregivers or whoever, you have to do it through technology, and you already have lost the crowd, those that don't have technology. So that's the way, that's just the game right now, okay? Unless you're boots on the ground, you're knocking on people's door, which you can't do, you're not going to hit everybody. So it's not easy. Can you offer an incentive? That's what I always look at. Like, what do they want? Understanding the lowest hanging fruit as well. And then the other route sometimes is you got to throw out something to them. Okay. Sometimes it's not about just okay, tell us, tell us, tell us. You know, as much as I suggested that earlier, we were talking about that. Sometimes you got to do the Steve Jobs approach, saying they're going to want, you know, this little thing that has 1,000 songs. Okay, even though people don't know what it is, you just throw it out there. We have this, and you got to just say, this is what we have. You know, try and find that early adopter. Say, you want this, right? And if they say, no, we don't, or yes, we do, then you go from there. Okay, that's kind of one angle of doing it. Sometimes you got to just be blunt and say, this is what we're going with, and this is what we're pursuing. Okay, and we know that we think you're the ideal patient or caregiver that wants this. Give us feedback, and they'll tell you right there. Okay, so that's a different perspective altogether. That's me.
I'm going to put in a plug, being a former person in the RAB for Toronto Rehab. In terms of paying participants, I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
There needs to be a compensation component to it. And I think a lot of times we are looking at trying as best we can to provide some offset for their transportation to get there, because that is often quite a big barrier. And if somebody's needing to take a taxi or a wheelchair taxi for every appointment, the cost can really build up. But in terms of paying our participants, I think we do need to provide some kind of a like an honorarium or compensation related to that, to make sure that we are indicating that we are fully valuing the time and contribution that they're putting into it. So there are quite a few comments in the chat, which is fantastic. So we have, okay, there's a comment about, hopefully, Erin, we've answered your question here. Okay, completely agree with the trust and adoption of technology in our collaboration with medical specialists. Okay, the question is, do you have to address these concerns in your own research or work? And do you have, how would you approach if you haven't? So in terms of addressing trust and adoption of technology being replaced by robots.
Right.
So
that's a great point, actually, because we actually had a discussion about this with a lot of physicians, because they are the #1 adopters of our technology in a sense of the end use of it. Technology is coming their way, and doctors are pretty intelligent, and everybody is aware of what's happening. The key thing is to make sure that it doesn't create if it's not taking away a step for them, it doesn't create an extra step for them. You know, making sure that it is compatible with whatever codes they need to use for billing, and that the data that you're providing them or assessing, or however the system is interpreting and providing feedback, is applicable to them within the realms that's been defined to them. Again, a lot of it goes to policy, and for policy to accept and adopt it, the trust of it, all these things come in, and things are adapting. For example, there was a HIPAA compliance, holistic healthcare. Now there's a PHIPAA, personalized HIPAA, where an individual can choose how much of their data they want to give versus one size fits all kind of regulations that were existent. So again, the regulations and the regulatory will change, but you can't wait for that to happen. It's kind of a chicken and egg type of thing. And I think in this case, building the technology, putting it out there, kind of the Steve Jobs kind of example, putting it ever present in front of people so they see the value, things will shift immediately towards what is progress and what is sensible. So yeah, I suppose that's kind of how the shift should occur.
Rosie, just one little comment on that, and this is not really answering the question, but just an area that I see that we have a lot of work, all of us, is that path from the healthcare physician to the patient, that there's no, the supports are very weak. Like, who is the geek squad right there, okay? So should the patient be calling, I do a lot of work on virtual care here with Ontario Health Teams. Should it be the patient calling the doctor, doc, I'm stuck with my password, right? You know, or I can't log in. You know, is it the front desk person there? Like, that's it, just throwing that out. Not really answering the question, but I just want to address that. That's one area. As you know, Mlad says, we don't want the doctor having extra work, you know, on the technology side of things. That's not really their role. We're missing that whole area.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think it does tie into some of this all of the discussion around integration, because you don't want something that's going to come in and take over your job, but you also want it to be contributing to how you're able to practice, and that you can see that the value in it is that it's going to help you with your job. And having that support and sort of ease of transition really, really does help to sort of encourage the buy-in, where it's like, it's not causing me more trouble, but it's actually helping me to do the best job that I can. Yeah. So very encouraging. There's a lot of conversation here about, yes, there will be some regulatory content and IP co-design. That's fantastic. Oh, and Kimberly is working with Health Canada to look at a talk related to that. So that's fantastic. It's hard for people interested in participating on projects to hear about available projects. Maybe a better place or platform to connect researchers with participants and partners. Excellent, excellent point, because there is a community of people out there who wants to be able to engage in research and to learn and to be able to participate.
I'll just make a comment on that there, and that's Mary Wang. So I know her; she's also a caregiver. It's getting better. Okay, so if I'm just looking at the past, from the past 5 years, I do a lot of work with patient engagement. It is getting better. Like again, Age Well. Many of you know Age Well. That part of that is having us at the tables. So, are we there? No, we're not there yet. But we're getting there. We're making dents.
All right, so got a message here to wrap up from Kimberly, which I was going to actually just ask if we have any other time, but it's 11:45 now, so I would like to thank Ron and Milad for participating in this panel and for offering all of their insights for us and the participants, and especially the students out there who are really, really craving the knowledge from the community and from industry as well. So really, really appreciate your taking the time to be with us. And I think, as Animesh said earlier, if you are able to jump in for the networking session, that would be amazing. We can answer some questions there as well. So back to Kimberly.
Great, thank you so much. Rosalie, Ron, and Malala, I want to add my thanks. And also, in particular, just say, we didn't plan in advance for any MIE 1080 students out there. All of the things that they said that are very relevant and pertinent to the lectures that you've been hearing, that's just because it's true. So thanks, guys, for making us look good. So we're going to go ahead and move to our HeRo trainee presentations. We do have 4 of them, and then we will have that open networking session. The first person up is Cheng Dai. He is a postdoc with in the surgical pillar under Yu Sun. And he is going to be talking to us about robotic intracytoplasmic sperm injection, the ICSI. Cheng Shen, if you're here, go ahead and turn on your video and take it away.
Yes, I am, but the message is saying I cannot start my video because the host has stopped it. Could you please figure it out?
Absolutely. There you go.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so my name is Changshen Dai. I'm a postdoc from Professor Sang's lab. The topic I'm presenting today is robotic intracytoplasmic sperm injection, ICSI. Next slide, please. According to World Health Organization, 1 in 6 couples worldwide is infertile, amounting to 50 million couples. And a lot of them require in vitro fertilization to have babies. And the ICSI is the most widely used techniques for in vitro fertilization. It is implemented by injecting a single sperm into an egg, but the live birth rate of ICSI has plateaued around 30% over the past decades. Additionally, the manual operation of ICSI under the microscope suffers from inconsistency and undesired cell damage. To overcome these limitations, we have developed a robotic ICSI system. Here, I will briefly introduce 2 key methods to achieve less invasive cell surgeries, cell orientation control, and cell injection. And the next slide, please. In ICSI, the cell need to be rotated so that the polar body is away from the injection site, but manual rotation suffers from large deformation. And we have developed robotic cell orientation control with minimal cell deformation. As shown on the top right, we firstly establish, the last slide. We establish deep neural networks to detect polar bodies with robustness to variations of polar body size and shapes. Then we designed an optimal controller. By minimizing the cost function, both cell orientation error and cell deformation can be minimized. So our polar body detection achieved an accuracy of 97%, and comparing to manual rotation, our robotic approach achieved much less orientation error, maximum deformation, and operation time. This work was awarded the Best Paper Award in Automation at the conference of ICRA 2019. The next slide, please. After rotation, the cell need to be penetrated to deposit a single sperm. But this process usually involves large cell deformation. And to reduce the deformation during penetration, we develop a piezo drill, as shown on the top right. The piezo drill is mounted on a standard micropipette holder. It uses the piezoelectric actuator to generate micropipette vibration. And the flexure beams are used to guide the motion along its axial direction. To prevent the piezo vibration to stir the cytoplasm, we use updated motion history image method to detect the membrane breakage. So once the cell is penetrated, the piezo drill will be stopped automatically. We first tested the piezo drill on hamster oocyte, and the use of piezo drill leads to a post-penetration survival rate of 92%, which is higher than the survival rate of 77% without piezo drill. Now the piezo drill is now undergoing a clinical trial in Hannam Fertility Center in Toronto, and the results from human oocytes show that the cell deformation during penetration with the piezo drill was 10 times less than that without piezo drill. The results are presented to the Scientific Congress of American Society of Reproductive Medicine. And with these robotic techniques, we hope to reduce the cell damage during manipulation and ultimately improve the live birth rate of ICSI. Thanks for listening, and your questions are welcome.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you so much, Chang-Chen. We're gonna go now moving on to next slide. Cabriya Thavaratnam, who is a doctoral candidate studying diagnostics with Dr. Hamilton. And she's gonna talk to us about a functional assay to diagnose. Yeah, nope, I'm gonna let her tell you. Thank you so much, Cabriya.
Hi there. My name's Cabriya, and I'm a PhD candidate at Sick Kids in Dr. Hamilton's lab. So I'm going to be talking about a functional assay. So we're developing a functional assay to diagnose catecholaminergic polymorphic ventricular tachycardia and heart failure patients at risk of developing ventricular tachycardia. Next slide, please. So what is CPVT and what's the pathophysiology exactly behind it? So CPVT is a rare arrhythmogenic disorder. It is characterized by abnormal heartbeats, and episodes can be triggered without any structural abnormalities found in the heart. So the exact prevalence of this disease is unknown, but it is predicted to affect about 1 out of 10,000 people. So events can be triggered by sympathetic activation, which means some type of physical activity like exercising or emotional stress. The most common mutation found in more than 60% of the cases is found on the RYR2 gene, which encodes this ryanodine receptor 2. This receptor is actually an intracellular receptor found on the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and its main function is to control calcium release into the cytosol to do downstream signaling or functions. And most commonly, we end up with the gain of function mutation, which results in leaky calcium channels. But recently, patients were also found with a loss of function gene as well. So either this receptor will have the mutation, or other proteins associated with this receptor will have the mutation. However, the end result is always a malfunction in the amount of calcium that is being released. Next slide, please. So currently, diagnosis is done by doing something called an exercise test. It's the primary diagnostic method for patients by making them exercise as a means of adrenergic activation to see if there's any ventricular tachycardia. Usually a positive test is highly accurate for these to predict CPVT. However, a negative test isn't sufficient to rule out whether these patients will have CPVT. When testing was done, about 13% of people who got a negative test ended up with observable cardiac events like syncope or even cardiac arrest later on. So more accurate and additional diagnostic tests must be developed. So to do that, to actually start with it, this ryanodine receptor, there's 3 isoforms. Ryanodine receptor 1 is found in skeletal muscle, 2, the one which we're looking at, is found in cardiac muscle, and 3 is predominantly found in brain tissue. So to assess this receptor's function without being invasive, we found out that another cell also commonly expresses RYR2, which is the T lymphocyte, which is found in blood. So we decided to extract these T cells from patient blood and run our analysis on that. So using flow cytometry and its microfluidics, we're assessing the sensitivity of the RYR2 receptors in patients to a well-known stimulant called caffeine. So depending on the amount of calcium being released, we'll determine whether this patient has a loss of function or a gain of function mutation. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, thanks. So how are we going to assess the receptor functionality? So using the common stimulant caffeine, we will stimulate this receptor, and we will use the couple methods to determine its functionality. So to measure calcium, so to do the calcium measurement, we will be using flow cytometry, which is an ideal method to simultaneously measure calcium flux and also identify CD3 positive T cells. So these T cells will be bound with CD3 antibodies, which are conjugated to a fluorochrome. And cells will also be loaded with fluoride dye, which is a calcium indicator dye. So this dye basically enters the cell, and it's conjugated to AM esters. And then once it gets into the cells, the AM portion is cleaved off, not allowing the dye to exit the cell. After that, when we're giving the caffeine stimulant, it will be able to bind the calcium, and using a ratiometric calculation, we'll be able to determine the concentration of the calcium that's present. Also, we'll be assessing a metabolic function by doing an ATP assay, which is like a luciferase assay on cultured T cells from the patients to evaluate the amount of ATP production that's here. Essentially, more ATP, we're thinking that more ATP will be used up in a gain of function situation. And we will also be measuring the intracellular pH, either using a proton assay or using a pH indicator molecule like SNARF. So basically, these 3 methods will be evaluated to see which one will be the most optimal method to assess RYR2 function, so that a functional assay can be developed or standardized across clinical labs to aid in the diagnosis of CPVT. Thank you.
That was fantastic. I'm very impressed that you managed to fit so much information into only 5 minutes. Cabria, thank you so much. Next up, we've got Lyle Gauthier. He's a master's student who's researching with Professor Eric Diller, and he's going to talk to us about the localization of a magnetic capsule robot for targeted gastrointestinal microbiome sampling. Take it away, Lyle.
Right. Thank you, Kimberly. And yeah, that's a bit of a mouthful, that one. So hello, everybody. My name is Lyle Gauthier, and like Kimberly introduced, I'm a master's student in the microrobotics lab under Professor Eric Diller. I'm here today to give you a window into my project, which is titled Localization of a Magnetic Capsule Robot for Targeted Gastrointestinal Microbiome Sampling. But before I get into the technical localization part of the topic, I'm first going to give a little background on the microbiome sampling part. So next slide, please. So over the past decade, as I'm sure you've heard and read, there's been a lot of research into the role that the bacteria in our gut plays in our overall body. Many studies have linked that the health of our gut microbiome is much more important than previously thought and can actually affect the health of our hearts and our brains, as well as the GI tract itself, of course. It's been a very popular topic, and the vast majority of the studies have actually been published between 2013 and now. So it's somewhat of a gold rush of scientific discovery happening. However, while the science has been advancing very quickly, the methods for collecting samples of the microbiome have not quite advanced at the same rate. In humans, the primary method for obtaining and analyzing the microbiome is still through stool samples, which can really only give a good representation of the later areas of the GI tract, like the colon and the large intestine. It doesn't quite paint a picture of the system as a whole. And most of the data that we do have on places like the lower stomach and the small intestine is obtained from animal studies. And the methods for obtaining samples in these studies are often quite invasive. And they often require sacrificing the animal to study its internal contents. Next slide, please. So this project is an effort to meet, there we go. Oh, well. So this project is an effort to meet this need for a new non-invasive and accurate sampling method. And what we're doing is designing magnetically actuated capsules, which you see on the left. These capsules are designed to be able to target specific sections of the GI tract for microbiome sampling. The idea being that the capsule is ingested, it moves through the gut to a desired area, it actuates and seals itself until it is excreted, and we can retrieve the sample for analysis. These capsules are designed to be simple and scalable without any complicated onboard electronics. And they work using simple magnetic mechanisms, which we can control and actuate remotely by applying low frequency magnetic fields. We also do have some capsule designs that can actually actuate themselves autonomously via pH sensitive hydrogels, which act as something of a trigger for the magnetic mechanisms, depending on the pH of the section of the GI tract that they're in. And those are being developed by my PhD student colleague, Priscilla. They're very neat. And as you can see on the right side, a challenge in designing and testing these capsules without any onboard electronics for communication, et cetera, is that we don't actually know where they are for in vivo conditions. This is a video of early tests that we conducted on pigs for these capsules. And as you can see, there wasn't really a way for us to tell where the capsule was. So we kind of had to randomly apply a magnetic field to try and open the capsule wherever it was in the pig. And that's what that wooden box is. It's actually holding a large permanent magnet. And that's what we use to apply a magnetic field. So this is the primary focus of my project, is to develop a system which not only determines the position of the capsule, but also its state of actuation. Is it open? Is it closed? Did we manage to sample at the proper time, or were we late, etc.? Next slide, please. All right, so here's a look into how I'm approaching this problem. Without using onboard electronics for communication, I've decided to make a system to track the capsules based on the magnetic field that they emit. I'm building a system which uses a grid of Hall effect sensors to detect the magnetic field of the capsule, and based on the readings of each individual sensor, of which there's 16, I can apply a nonlinear least squares minimization algorithm to estimate what position and orientation of the capsule aligns with the values read by all 6 sensors. So essentially tuning where we estimate the capsule is in 3D space and orientation space that it emits a magnetic field that provides a solution for all of the sensors. And I do this not just for the capsule as a whole, but actually for each individual magnet within the capsule frame, because tracking each individual magnet and where they're pointing is the key to telling me what the actuation state of the capsule is. Again, is it open? Is it closed? So on the left side are some demonstrations of how I've simulated the system work so far. The top video being an example of tracking the capsule as it moves through a spiral path, and the images below showing how it can be determined if the capsule is open or closed based on one of the previous designs on the last slide, which the more horizontally oriented arrows on the left side is a closed capsule, and the right side image where the magnets are more vertically aligned represents an open capsule. So on the right is also an image of the first prototype that I've built so far, and one of the ways that I intend to test it We will have a robotic arm installed in our lab soon, and I plan to mount the capsules to it and actually track the capsule as it moves through a path to specific points. And finally, to give a longer range outlook into my plans, once I've tested and tuned the system, I actually intend to build an improved version, which we can then apply into future in vivo tests that we will be conducting in pigs, hopefully this summer. Something that we can actually strap to the pigs and watch the capsule move through the whole GI tract, and hopefully be able to estimate when it's taken a sample, or so that we can know when to actuate to take a sample. So that is an outlook into my project and my research status. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Lyle. I look forward to pig videos this summer. That's fantastic. And so Masa Khalili, next slide, please. Masa Khalili is our next and final HeRo trainee presentation for this afternoon. She is a doctoral candidate studying in the assistive pillar under Michael van der Loos. She's going to tell us about adaptive and modular technologies for wheeled mobility device users. Masa, are you here?
Yeah, but I can't enable my video. Okay, now it works. Great. Hi, everyone. As Kimberly mentioned, I'm Masa Khalili. I'm a PhD candidate at the School of Biomedical Engineering at the University of British Columbia. The work that I'm presenting today is a collaboration between researchers at the Advanced Robotics Systems Lab at UBC, occupational therapists at the International Collaboration on Repair Discoveries, and assistive technology developers at the British Columbia Institute of Technology in Vancouver. Next slide, please. Manual wheelchairs are the most commonly used wheeled mobility assistive devices around the world. And these devices are easy to maneuver, easy to transport, and also promote an active lifestyle. However, propelling a manual wheelchair is a physically high demanding task, and over time use of these devices may lead to secondary health conditions such as upper extremity, joint degeneration, and pain. More recently, there has been a surge in the design and development of modular power add-ons that can be attached to manual wheelchairs and provide on-demand power assist to users. Here at the bottom, you can see some examples of these power add-ons, including a rear end attachment, a front end attachment, and power wheels. Our collaborators at the Red Lab at BCIT are developing similar power add-ons with the focus on improving the modularity of these devices, as well as enhancing accessibility to different environments. At the CARES Lab at UBC, we are developing advanced control methods to optimally control these power add-ons, with the focus on enhancing the autonomy of users, as well as improving the usability of these power add-ons. Next slide, please. To achieve these objectives, we are developing adaptive controllers that predict user intentions and provide appropriate assistant torque accordingly. Here at the top, we can see a combination of different wheelchair maneuvers, including left and right turns, as well as a straight propulsion. We conducted experiments and asked participants to follow these predefined paths at a self-selected and comfortable velocity, something similar to what they do in daily life activities. During these activities, we recorded the user input torque to the left and right push rims. And after this, after analyzing and filtering the measurements, we extracted relevant features from these kinetic measurements, and we used unsupervised classification methods to extract the implicit user intentions from these kinetic measurements. As you can see in the bottom graphs, the clusters that emerge from user push-rim interactions, which are also color-coded with the labels presented on the right side of these graphs, they represent different states of motion, or actually implicit user intentions that match with the actual wheelchair activities shown above. For example, the dots that are color-coded as yellow are related to when the user was actually doing a right turn, and we could correctly recognize those intentions by using these classification methods. And the intention estimate, this intention estimation framework that we developed is computationally efficient and can be implemented in real time. Additionally, using this framework can contribute to improving power add-ons controllability and maneuverability when performing different daily life activities. Next slide, please. When using these wheelchair add-ons, wheelchair users can navigate a variety of indoor and outdoor terrains. Therefore, it's crucial to use and implement a controller that can adapt to different environmental conditions and changes. To achieve this objective, we conducted experiments in which participants were performing common daily life wheelchair activities on different terrains. We performed experiments on 3 indoor terrains of carpet, linoleum, concrete, and 4 outdoor terrains of grass, gravel, asphalt, and sidewalk. We instrumented the wheelchair with an inertial measurement unit sensor, or IMU, to collect acceleration and gyroscope data. We then used these kinematic measurements with a machine learning pipeline to first extract relevant time and frequency domain features, then to classify different terrain types. Our findings showed that we can achieve high prediction accuracy when classifying indoor versus outdoor terrains. However, we found that the classification accuracy decreases when aiming to differentiate more similar terrains, such as a smooth concrete or linoleum. Currently, we're performing further analysis to improve this classification pipeline and using optimal parameters that can be used to actually improve the classification accuracy for a combination of different indoor and outdoor terrains. The proposed terrain classification framework is cost-effective and can be used for real-time control applications. And the classifier output can be actually used to adjust the power add-on velocity or torque on different terrains, which may as well improve users' safety and stability when using these power add-ons. Next slide, please. Yeah, you can find more detailed information about our work in the list of publications. And in the end, I would like to thank our research team and acknowledge the funding agencies that supported this work. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Masa. That was wonderful to hear. Next slide, please, Dylan.
On behalf of the Institute, especially on behalf of Kimberly, Rosalie, and Animesh, and also Chi-Hong and Dylan and Mayhak, thank you for your help. You're organizing the event. I tremendously enjoyed the session in the morning, all the panel discussions. You might hear kids yelling. That's my working environment. If someone tells you working from home is good, I'm the first one to disagree. But anyhow, so this morning, I think we heard not only technical discussions, but also from end user perspective, industry perspectives. So we will organize more events like this to communicate with each other, not only on technical issues, but also on the wider, all the stakeholders' perspectives. So we have a second day on February 19th, which Kimberly will tell you more about. We'll have keynote speakers, more panel discussions. And I want to encourage you, if you can, to stay for a few more minutes. That Animesh, our fabulous, one of the 2 fabulous MCs, will coordinate a wonderful discussion session as well for our trainees and everybody to speak up. I don't think I have more to say. I enjoyed the morning. I especially enjoyed seeing so many faces, and I look forward to seeing you back on campus, but I know that dream will not be realized easily. But anyhow, so I hand it back to you, Kimberly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sun. Dylan, if you want to stop screen sharing, and Animesh is going to take over and lead us through some open conversation. And so I hope everybody is prepared to ask their questions. Thank you. Animesh?
Thank you. So I think this is wonderful segue. Now is the time for freewheeling discussions and all sorts of Q&A that we were not able to go through in our previous chats. Some of, I'm just trying to go through the participants list right now. Some of the people and panelists from this morning are available. Do I see Aman? I'm sorry, excuse me, I'm just like trying to go through the participant list.
Yes, Aman is here.
Yes. So what would be a good time to do here is Aman is here. I see Ron, Rosalie as well. So for students to perhaps feel free to unmute and ask questions, and I can play moderator. I got my chance to ask questions. I do have more, by the way, but this is the time for perhaps students to ask and lead interesting discussions. If you feel that you may not want to be able to, then I can sort of also read off questions from chat. So we have one person who has hand up, Kevin. Kevin, go ahead.
Thank you. So yeah, thanks for hosting the event. Thanks for all of the panelists to come here and talk about this. So my question was, currently there's a lot of technologies being developed for edge cases or rare conditions, and that's important development. So I was wondering how you give those value to investors to get the funds required to bring them from like academic to clinical settings.
So that's a wonderful question. So I'm trying to think who would be the right person to answer this. Maybe we can start with Aman, and then perhaps others can chime in as well.
Yeah, no, it's a big question, and it goes back a little bit to my comment about sort of the investment community and sort of the current status of the investment community. I think we do a really good job of getting sort of the proof of concept and proof of principle funded through various programs, either through industry partners or direct investment, or through government programs and that kind of thing. The real struggle is that sort of middle part, right? How do you get somebody to bet on your idea? And depending on the scope of it, and especially if you're talking about things that are not edge cases, how do you get somebody to bet the tens or easily tens of millions of dollars that it will take to bring that to fruition? And I think that's I honestly don't have the answer to that, because we've had our own struggles, and we've been, I'd say, pretty effective at raising funds, but we still had not raised funds to the level that we would have originally wanted to do the type of scale and scope that we've been hoping to. So it's a huge question, because you are literally talking about tens of millions of dollars, and I think that to get to those types of levels, we do need support through our government agencies and all of that. And there are certainly some programs out there to sort of bridge that gap. I mean, it's interesting. Like it's reasonable to raise the the relatively small early amounts to get through proof of concept, and when you've proven outcomes or effectiveness, it's actually reasonably easy to get that funding to sort of push you through scale, and that it's that sort of middle piece that we need to bridge. That's the real challenge. And I think we need to work together with the government agencies to really support the innovation sector, and they are starting to to develop that. There are some groups, industry groups, that are advocating for support in that range. It is honestly, I think, is the biggest challenge that we have with innovation in this space in Canada right now.
It's interesting that you note this in this manner, where you basically mentioned that one of the sort of challenges is to actually get the middle part of the funding, or what you would call like getting series, probably, or seed might be easier, series A and series B might be trickier. So in this particular space, healthcare, maybe healthcare devices or hardware, what is trickier, or how is this trickier compared to more traditional software as a service, which is the bulk of VC funding? To do this, should we as students and faculty try to use our time in the university as incubation, so that when we go out for the first time we are ready? Or should we actually go out with ideas? And there's a full spectrum in between. So curious what both people in the industry like Aman, and I also see Sun and Eric here as well. So feel free to comment on that as well.
Can I just comment on the
Yes.
first part? Just talking about, I think the question about how do we get technologies out there for products that would potentially have a small market. So when we talk about rehabilitation technologies, this is like essentially the world that we live in. We have very small-ish populations with very specific needs. And I've talked to people in industry before where it is essentially sort of their perspective that they're not going to be actually going to be gaining huge profits with these technologies. And so it does become a very, very big barrier for overcoming that, I guess, the valley of death, trying to transition to a product onto the market. Some of the directions that are moving in sort of the global perspective with the World Health Organization. So they have an initiative called GATE that is looking at using sort of global market forces to actually help to support smaller scale products, which may not necessarily have the same volume in terms of trying to bring those products out to market. And some of the innovation hubs, like for example, the one in Montreal, they're talking about sort of orienting not necessarily to investors in industry per se, but looking at leveraging philanthropy. And so foundations, charities that potentially would have opportunities for you know, building up resources to actually help sort of projects get over that hump in terms of the development process and getting the proof of concept and things like that. So those potentially could be, you know, two avenues to kind of keep a pulse on in terms of getting potential support for innovations.
Any follow-up questions? If you do not ask questions right away, I will be the question hog.
I'm going to take that role from you for a little bit. I just had one follow-up question. And that was, when you're designing technologies, like, do you normally start from the solution or do you start from the technology? Like, do you find a problem and then try to apply technology to it? Or do you have a technology and then try to apply it to a problem?
I mean, I'd say the ideal answer to that is to find the problem first, and then find the tech, and then develop the appropriate technology. You know, the adage of if you got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You know, I'd say the preferred approach is definitely. I mean, there's always a bit of a balance between the two, because you know you've got your human limitations in terms of your technical background is going to cover a certain range, and you know you can certainly learn and expand outside that range. So there is going to be a bit of a balance there, but really the right way to do product development is to find the problem, evaluate the technologies available currently, understand why they're not working, and then use your ingenuity to come up with different and creative ways to solve that problem that others may not have. You know, one of the things that's I think the most important is to look at all the things that have tried and failed. You know, if you look, you know, the space that we're in is interventional cardiology. It's an absolute huge graveyard of devices that have tried to solve some of the problems that we're looking to solve and have failed for various reasons. And you know, you can learn a lot of lessons from those, whether it was, you know, a technological limitation, whether it was a market fit limitation in terms of, you know, finding the appropriate payers, or but you know, you don't want to repeat some of the mistakes, and you know, mistakes is probably a brutal word to use, but you know, you don't want to. If you could have learned reasons why things won't work early on, you'll want to take advantage of that as best as possible. But absolutely, I would look to the problem first and find the appropriate technology, because otherwise you may be biased with your proposed solution that's going out looking for problems that it might help with.
I'll add a few words to what Aman said. What Aman said is the only way to develop a product. I wholeheartedly agree to that. So that sometimes goes against how academic research is done. I speak from the academic perspective. I think a lot of our research at the university, not only U of T, just in academia, is really to push the boundary of technologies. So sometimes grad students, unless you are determined to start a company, to be an entrepreneur on day one, I think curiosity-driven research is equally important in the university environment. But I agree that a lot of, or maybe the majority of university research does not end up on the market. It's because it goes against the product development. There's not a clear market. It's not really user requirement based. So I think the world is beautiful really because we go from both ways, really depending on the student, the trainee, what is your desire or dream. But if you're a curiosity-driven student, I think the training in university doesn't really defeat you to start up a company after graduation, because the way you are trained, the problem-solving definition we define in academic research sometimes is not the same as product development. But I think it doesn't go against that. The model of training, problem-solving, problem definition, and information digging, assessment of competition, etc. So overall, I think a trainee, a student needs to be careful in that if you want to get on the wagon of commercialization immediately, you probably don't want to go for the academic, curiosity-driven, the boundary pushing approach. But if you are doing your PhD, not necessarily going for academic job in the future, I think the general curiosity-driven type of research actually teaches you more. Doesn't make you a better entrepreneur, but I don't think it makes you a worse entrepreneur after graduation. Anyhow, that's what I wanted to add. There are consistencies and also some discrepancies between the two routes. And luckily,
so
luckily while I'm
ahead.
talking to us now, there was no kid yelling. I have to mute myself now.
So we have Ron, but I do want to add one more thing. Actually, so I've been on both sides, particularly in healthcare innovation. I've been I've actually been on three sides: funding, getting funded, and technology development. And I think most of the people here today are somewhere in between, in the sense that you are not pure science who are solving the 50-year-old problem either. A lot of you are actually engineering students. You are solving problems to create transformative technology, hopefully for the next 5 and 10 years. Even your research training, as Sun pointed out, is actually not very far from what you might need to do as an entrepreneur. You have to convince people who are not in your field necessarily that what you have done is meaningful. You have to convince people that whatever you are doing may not work yet. You have a proof of concept, hopefully, but has value eventually, right? Otherwise no one's going to buy this. And you can sort of see this theme even in, let's say, the vision talks from faculty or faculty candidates. So it's interesting that I don't see, from my own perspective, that these are actually misaligned at all. The only things that that may feel that startup and not startup, you should write, instead of thinking about that, it might be a better way to think about is, how can you convey impact of your work already, or maybe 3 years sort of extrapolated, and that's what you need to show to sort of people who you are trying to raise money from, or you are trying to get jobs from, and most people would sort of maybe the only difference would be the language, but in general, if you follow of like how can I actually connect my work to impact, that would be the best. And for students, that is, and this happens at companies as well, how can I make the cycle of showing whatever I'm doing has value shortest? So figure out what experiments can you run in complete loop to validate your idea. So not just the high level sort of proof of concept, but actually, is this solving a problem? And does that problem need solving?
And if I could just add one thing to that, and it's probably implicit in what you were saying, certainly it's about the potential impact of what you are doing, but also, you need to sell yourself as to why you are the appropriate person and you are capable of actually doing this, right? So you can have the technology that has the potential impact, you can do all that research, but you also have to sell that, you and your group are capable of actually executing on this.
Yes, I think the mantra that so I took product development classes as grad students, and they taught us this three-part thing, which is true actually for faculty talks. Why this, why now, why you? You should always have the answer to this question, including your PhD thesis. Anyways, Ron, go ahead, please.
So Kevin, I'll give you my perspective. Now, you heard me, I presented as a patient, but I do a lot of work with innovators as well. And on the other end, I also have judged many hackathons, okay, all across Canada. I've done probably 24 hackathons, health hackathons. So I got to see, when you heard my comment earlier, don't just have engineers together, right? Okay, because I've saw teams where the engineers are there, the healthcare teams are there, and they're not talking to each other, right? They're doing their own projects, okay? So my answer to this is I actually will say it's from both sides, okay? It's not just from one side, okay? One of them is going to work, okay? But some give you a better chance of success, okay? You heard me comment, begin with the end in mind. So that's Stephen Covey, one of his 7 habits, okay? If you begin with the end in mind, you can reverse engineer it. That's one way to approach. Then there's the other approach, okay? And there's a gentleman, for example, by the name of Gary Dahl, okay? Something he did was called the pet rock. Are you familiar with the pet rock? Some of you guys might know it, but the pet rock, okay, is pretty much a rock. And he made millions of dollars convincing people that you need this as your social pet, okay? This is going to be your pet rock. And this is about pitching, how you tell the story, how you convey, the value, the impact, which is what Aman and Animesh was just talking about a little bit here. Okay, that it's about, sometimes it's that side where I really believe the academia community and researchers struggle with, okay, is about communicating your story, okay? And, you've heard the things called the elevator pitch, okay? Like just even that elevator pitch. I'll challenge all of you to learn the escalator pitch, okay? The escalator pitch is not when you're in the elevator going up, for 30 seconds. It's when you're coming across that person, okay, on the escalator, and you got that moment to say something within 30 seconds, or not 30 seconds, within 5 seconds, okay, of what you want to say, okay? But it comes back to when I talk about the pet rock, here's a gentleman just that convinced the community on the story that these rocks he could grab wherever and package it nicely, can be good for your health, can be, and people bought into it, okay? Do you need science for that? Well, it depends what your definition of success is. If it's about money, well, he succeeded. He became a millionaire on that, okay? Is it on did the rock really help people? Well, I don't know. Some people will say yes, but it's just, there's no one answer to this there. Like, the thing is you got to keep at it, that's one piece, okay? You got to keep pitching, or selling. Those are the words I'm throwing out from that angle, but you just got to be out there talking to people, applying for things, and be willing to fail. As I told you earlier, I talked a fair bit of failure, my acronym, find another important lesson. But if you're not failing, that means you're not making the effort enough, okay? You're not failing enough. So there is no one path to success. That's the bottom line, I think, here. That's what I'm going to throw out to you. But if I were to pick, can you get better in this community? I think it's around the pitches, telling the story, communicating it, that knowledge translation piece, knowledge mobilization that we were talking about earlier. Okay. My thoughts.
I had a thought, if I could jump in for a moment here.
Thanks a lot, Ron. Yeah, go ahead, Cam.
Just kind of building off of Ron and Animesh as well, talking about like value. It seems to me that we're using the same word to describe multiple things that are not necessarily closely related. So when it seems to me that when I'm trying to convince a potential investor, like a venture capitalist, of the value, it's not really value that they're interested in, it's profitability. But for me, perhaps as a researcher, as someone who's curious, I might see inherent value in knowledge or creation, or maybe from the compassionate side, I see value in perhaps bringing some advantage to people's lives who really need it. And then I think there's also finally that value from the end user perspective. If somebody has recently become blind from an accident, what would they give to be able to see their family again? That value is incalculable. So I think that when we talk about like convincing people of value, again, and this goes back to like Ron's point about the pet rock, what is the value of a rock, right? Like, what does that even mean? Like from a manufacturing perspective, it's nil. You can pick them up off the ground, but then you can convince people that it has value and convince them to pay for it. So I think that there's a steep disconnect between what is profitable and what might be actually valuable to those end users. And maybe is there a disconnect there between what we are trying to bring to market versus what people really need? Do people really need pet rocks, or do they need something else that maybe is not as attractive to investors?
I think the answer to that, and I hope others can also chime in, I am not as experienced. The intersection of that subset is not zero. That I think that is the primary sort of shortest answer I have. While I would agree that it's both ways, but and the art of picking the problem is that. Go ahead, Ron. Yes, please.
So Cameron, you're, in my opinion, absolutely correct. The value, the understand, that's so critical to have that skill set to know what's in it for them. Okay, get in someone else's shoes. You heard me talk about the Rons. Okay, it's my name. You know, the return on the numbers. What are their numbers? Okay, versus what your numbers are. Okay, everyone has an algorithm. I'm talking to this crowd. Okay, Ron's algorithm. Ron equals, you know, he likes cooking, he likes food, he likes technology, he likes virtual reality. Like, you know, this is Ron. Okay, my tip to all of you, it's one of my habits is before this, I never knew who Yu Sun was or Kimberly Colburn was, but I researched them. Okay, I used to go to conferences or meetings. I look at the list. I would spend that time. Rosalie, I don't know if you were there when I did Age Well. I went to the very first, they invited me for the training session to be a mentor. I studied the 50 people that were going to be there that week. And I played a game and I had a fact of everybody. I said, here's a fact. Can you, oh, Aaron, you were there. Aaron was there, right? If you remember Aaron, right? You were there.
Yeah.
Where was that? Where were we? Somewhere in Quebec, right?
Quebec, yeah.
Yeah, but that ability to know what is of value to everyone. And I can't recall right now what, oh, Aaron, I think it was tennis. You were tennis. You play tennis or something like that. Someone plays tennis. Knowing the value of where the other side's coming from, that individual or the organization, okay, or the company, okay, is it for profit? Is it not for profit? You know, is it for the greater good? Whatever it is, if you understand that, you have an advantage going into that conversation, okay? And that is a skill that you have to develop. There's techniques to do that. I gave an example. Do your homework, okay? That going in to know ahead of who the crowd is will give you a big advantage, okay? But you're correct, Cameron. Okay, you have to know that what your value is know yours, but the skill is, can you find out what the other side is, okay? And I'm not just talking about the business and all that stuff. I talked to you about the psychographics, right? If you know that one little fun little personal fact, that one little thing that, hey, this guy likes music, okay? Or she likes, you know, this kind of food, whatever it may be, that helps in those conversations, okay? So Cameron, you're correct, yeah. It's, but it's a skill, yeah.
Sorry, can I do a follow-up? How would you translate that to robotics? So for instance, I worked on personalization in long-term human-robot interaction during my PhD. And so I saw that there's the challenges, there's the benefits, but it depends on the area. It depends on the person, it depends on how they adopt it and how they, basically. So as I would like to ask back to all the panelists and the academicians here, what is it that you see would benefit, and what are the areas for personalization in the healthcare, and what would be the challenges for it?
Bahar, am I saying your name correctly?
Yes.
I think the audio was a bit choppy. So if I can sort of phrase the question, you said, what are the primary challenges in this sort of context for robotics?
Areas for yes, areas for personalization in your areas, and what are the challenges that would bring, the benefits and the challenges that would bring in the areas that you think would benefit personalization.
Okay, so let me play moderator, and I'm going to call out people to answer the question. Can maybe start with Rosalie.
Maybe just a clarification, Bahar. Do you mean personalization for the products or personalization for you as an investigator or a researcher or developer?
Personalization of the robot to the patient, to the medical specialist, to whoever, to the end user.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, really great question. It's this is a tricky one because I think oftentimes you would like to be able to make things as customizable, personalizable, modular as possible so that you have a great number of users and people who could benefit from it. And again, it's going to be, I think, an engineering challenge to try and balance like some of the cost trade-offs and all of the other, you know, potential trade-offs. But to really be able to tackle getting information, there's a lot of methods that you can use to understand the users, sort of immerse yourself in the environments where people are using it, and you get to hear the concerns they have, see the concerns they have, and then you start building sort of a mental model of what your solution might look like. And obviously, you know, you have lots of iterative sort of mechanisms to be able to get feedback. And I think as Aman was talking about in some of the other discussions as well with Milad, looking at, you know, iterations and, you know, bringing your products to the potential users to get them to let you know whether or not you've got, you know, the right understanding, or, you know, things might come up as new sort of opportunities if they lay their eyes on something, if they test it out. And so when we're talking about development, trying to work out what can be customizable, what should be customizable, you know, what would be a viable product if it's going to be on the market, all of those questions, you know, it's an ongoing list. And again, it'll be an interesting sort of mashup between, you know, what you think as a researcher would be possible, what is realistic, and what would be sellable at the end of it, and what would people adopt. So it's a long road, but I think it's a valuable one because personalization is really critical for adoption at the end of it. So, but getting that balance right is tricky.
Yeah, if I could jump in.
Thanks, Rosalie. Aaron, go ahead. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, I think actually from my own PhD work, I found that it's like a unique thing that we get in research is the ability to take the time to personalize something specifically for someone. So like in my own project, being able to make a glove that was the exact size for somebody's hand. And then from that, you learn both like you get to work with this process with somebody, and you get to make something, as Ron said, that, you know, gives directly to them, and you're providing value directly to them. And I think that from that, you create a connection that, you know, you learn more needs about them. You learn that in my case, your device should provide more fingers of extension or more flexion. So I think that you learn a lot more from the person as you personalize the device for them. And yeah, I think that also just being able to personalize makes you able to tune the device to a lot of different people. And that could be whether it's like the textile fit, whether that's like different manufacturing aspects, or whether that's the control of the device, whether you know, somebody wants to control something using their muscles, somebody wants to control something using force, somebody else wants to control something with their mind. So all those options I find are very valuable.
Hi, I just want to just make a comment, and just based on my experience. My name is Chaitali, by the way, and I work with Ron and now Rosalie. It's very exciting. I'm a novice researcher. I'm still thinking about which PhD I want to do, but it's nice to hear from all of you in terms of how your projects and stuff is going on. But as an engineer, though, I worked in manufacturing and healthcare both for a very long time. And I think from a tech or process perspective, it's all about just optimizing someone's environment, right? So that's the way I see it. And some of the things that I've done that have worked as an engineer is really getting on the ground and doing observations. I've spent 15 to 20 hours in the operating room, observing surgeries I've never seen before. So I'm just providing that feedback to all of you in terms of, oh, well, what are the needs and what should we do and what all that kind of stuff. But I just found that, you know, doing observations, talking to the people who actually do the work, working with interdisciplinary teams, and, you know, getting a sense of how they feel and how they work in their own environment has helped in developing processes, especially in healthcare, you know, working with different types of surgeons, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the observation part was key for me to understand what is happening in their environment and help them and work with them to develop processes that help them optimize their environment or whatever it is that they want to solve. So that's helped for me. And that's not just in healthcare, it was in manufacturing as well. So I just thought I would just provide that feedback. And I just think that as researchers, I work with many researchers as well, and I think researchers don't get that opportunity, you know, in the beginning of their projects to do stuff like that, but really trying to understand what problem are you really trying to solve is so important. And I think maybe that's why I'm taking my time right now to figure out which PhD I want to do, because I don't know if I'm ready to jump in, because I'm so used to being on the ground. And working with Rosalie right now in the last few weeks, it's been very challenging for me to really step back and being part of the discovery process around looking at articles and things like that. It's very new to me. I'm so used to getting on the ground and just doing the observations and things, but it has helped in solving problems in healthcare. And I've been with Sunnybrook for over 6 years now. Prior to that, many other hospitals. So just thought I would give that feedback.
So let me ask a question, not just to PhD advisors, but also a lot of students here. A lot of you are in the business of arguably problem solving or research problem solving, sometimes coming up with new ideas. How do you balance efforts to do one-off problem solving versus finding solutions that solve the problem once and for all, or sort of generalize? Because in research, or at least in academia, and actually I would argue even in an industrial setup, you want to find solutions where you spend time to come up with something that you don't have to solve again. Because if you have to do it once over and over again, the same thing, so I have to, let me make up an example. I have to personalize the glove example that Anne was giving for this one person and find the right sort of parameter settings of the fabric, the size, and so on and so forth. And I don't know about the full problem, Aaron, so excuse me for my naivete here. But I solved this for this one person. Then I have this other person, I have to do it again. But then the whole concept, at least in my head, the whole point of this endeavor is to reduce art to science, or art to practice, right? When you're doing it one-offs, that's art. When you know, and you have reduced that to a point where at this point it's a procedural setup, and you can do this over and over and over again, and you can tell others to do it, that's when you have reduced it to sort of like solution. So and this is a problem that a lot of students I have seen have had trouble with, because doing the one-off solution is actually the easy and the most natural thing that comes to a lot of makers, right? I see a problem and I'm very tempted to build a solution for this case. Why? Because I can do it. I know the skills. I have prototyping skills. I have software chops, and I can solve this. But that's a hot fix according to me. So how do you battle that urge? And how do you come up with solutions which sort of solve the problem once and for all. And the latter is actually tricky, very hard, but that's the whole point of this endeavor. So maybe let's flip the speakers. I only see the students with their videos on. So if you want to be on the front screen, turn your video on if you want to. So let me start with eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Kevin.
Hello. Sorry, what were you asking me?
So how do you balance the urge to solve one-off problems with your skills? You can have maker skills, you can have software skills, but instead of creating one-off hotfixes, that is also problem solving. But that's equivalent to in my sort of book, and I'm just sort of extrapolating this to make it more caricaturish. On one end, you are creating Rube Gold, which are basically these extremely intricate contraptions that solve this one problem, but they will never generalize. On the other end, you are trying to find common principles that once you do this, the next time the same problem presents itself, you will be faster at solving it. Or you will probably be able to take your solution and apply it as is, because that's what provides you scale.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I'm fully qualified to answer this question, but from my experience and what you've all said, that really just comes down to being able to define the problem well. For example, like say you have a coding problem, right? You can solve that once, or you can also, like when you just have, for example, all your code in one long file, and that would solve the problem once. But then let's say you're seeing this problem multiple times in different assignments, and then you modularize your code. So now each time you would be able to run that code, and then you would solve that problem each time you see it. So how would I balance my time? Well, because I'm a student, I don't really have too much of a choice in this. Like, if I have an assignment, I have to do it no matter what, right? But if I want to work on personal projects, then yeah, it really just comes down to defining a good problem to solve. Not sure if that's the answer you're looking for.
I think that's fine. Maybe let me put the pointer to Bahar. Would you want to comment on this?
Just muted. I was thinking that research is for the PhD students, research is always an ongoing process. There's no one solution. You need to iterate all the time. So if you do think, if you just find up a solution and you apply it, you can easily see that it doesn't always just fit well. That it needs to be continuously changed, like adapt, personalize to the person. But it's also that you also need to have a solution in the first place to start with. So it's kind of, you need to first try to come up with a general solution and then iteratively update it to fit the problem better. That's what I would say.
That's wonderful advice. So maybe from some advice from someone like who has done it multiple times. Sun, do you care to comment?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sun.
Me?
Yes, sir.
Oh, it's like in the undergrad classroom and students ask me, why me? Anyhow, it's a very general, broad question. I think we should all agree that there is no general enough solution to a problem. We all struggle, that we identify all the variables, we build a beautiful, complex model. We all hope that thing will solve the whole world's problem, and it doesn't. So I think we need to have a balance, a real balance, not just philosophically, in that I think for a real company, not academia, I don't believe there is real or 100% personalization. I think more models of your product, for example, the gloves, to have small, super small, and medium, and somehow medium. You have a richer model, list of models of your products. I think that somehow goes closer to personalization, unless the products are very simple. it's a pure mechanical part or clothes type of thing. They can do 3D printing and things. And so I'm a pessimistic person going for truly personalization, even drug development today. If you guys don't know that if someone sequences your genome and they tell you there's a magic drug perfect for you, just for you, don't believe in that. Because I did my research and you'll look at the past 12 years that the number of genome targeting drug is very low. And even if you are sequenced for a genome, the perfect, molecularly perfect drug most likely is not there on the market. And even if it existed, you take it, that doesn't necessarily work for you because theoretically it's a perfect. We all know how theory and practicality differ in life. So I just want to say that I think true personalization doesn't exist. As a researcher, we should understand a problem as general as possible, build a model as applicable as possible. Don't stretch it too far to fool yourself that this model is so general that it just governs the whole world. And most likely that model is useless. It's a very qualitative model, doesn't really guide anything useful when you really put it in practice. So I don't know what I said, but my name was called, so
Okay.
I had to say something. I'm done here.
Acceptable answer.
If I could,
I think Lyle, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to give
Lyle and then Ron. Yeah.
Okay, I was just going to lend some weight to what Kevin and Bahar said earlier. Was before I started grad studies here at U of T, I actually worked as an R&D engineer back on my home province of Prince Edward Island. And before anyone comments, yes, it did involve potatoes. And our process often was we made agricultural equipment, and our process for balancing this personalization versus generalization was typically actually to start at the personalization level. So I think it was Vitor earlier that said there's no substitute for actually being there and doing research on people. So I would often actually spend a lot of time on farms, watching farmers work and kind of finding a problem that we can optimize for them and coming up with design of a machine that I used to make the joke would be just shy of having a feature to give them a scalp massage and make their kids think they're cool. But and then the process was always kind of cyclical from there. We would design this very personalized machine, and then we would come back and see if we could apply it to another farm. And if it couldn't, then we would pare back a couple of the features and then add more features from the other farm. And it was this constant cycle of personalization and then pairing or pulling back the features until we had a very good understanding of what the most fundamental problem that all of them shared was. We could try to add some, if there were some easy features that could be implemented that did personalize a little bit, then we would add those if we could. But it was always about just constantly cycling between personalization and generalization to kind of liquidize and figure out what that foundation of the problem is. And then we would work from there. We would have a general machine, and then we could add things to it to hopefully convince farmers to buy it, because they were infamously difficult to get to adopt new technology.
That's wonderful. I think that sort of, let's say, crystallizes the answer that Bahar made, where it's not a clear answer. You probably start with a solution and then sort of distill it and pair it back. Ron had a comment as well.
Yes,
please.
I'll be super quick because I got to get to a meeting at 1. But what Lyle said, the cycling, yes. And is there a balance, a formula? No. Okay. And what I'm going to say is, because I don't think that's a fair question. Okay. If you take the bigger picture, okay, you have two different games going on: the world of academia with its set of rules, and the world of outside of academia and its set of rules. Okay. It's like saying, okay, well, you're telling basketball players, and hockey players, well, how do you play together? Where's that balance here? Different rules and different games. Okay. Academia is about defending your thesis, defending, your side. Okay. And the way I challenge everyone to look at it this way is to say, okay, even to the patients, don't forget the patients and the caregivers, who you're dealing with. Okay. You give $1,000 to a patient and a caregiver. You give $1,000 to academia, okay, the researchers. You give $1,000 to innovators, let's say, okay? How are they going to try and solve the same problem? Okay, it's still the same amount, but it's different. You ask by time, how do you balance the time? I'll say you give, you get like with academia, it's like, okay, here's the here's your challenge. You have until the end of next term. Where from the innovation side, we're saying, why are they taking forever? We could do that in the next month, but they have the whole term to do this. So you spread it out. Just different games of how you play. So that's why I don't think that was a fair question, okay? Or that question is like, you're dealing with, yeah, hockey players and basketball players, let's say. Just not really the same. There's overlap, but it's a question of, can you get the skills of the other side there? But that's just my thoughts. And I'm going to say bye to everyone. I got to go. But it was lovely to see all of you. Okay. And
thank you. I think that is a very good segue to sort of bring this to a close. We are also on time exactly. I would say it has been a wonderful day of interaction with panelists, with all of the candidates and all of the students and our audience broadly who have attended today. And I would like sort of to pass the baton to Sun, I think, who will have some closing remarks. But before that, I do want to say thank you for organization. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks very much. It's 1 o'clock. I'll only use 1 or 2 minutes of your time. In that, Holly texted me. I think everybody knows Holly Siegel. Holly, you can wave your hand. She's one of the most important members in our Robotics Institute. And she commented in the text that she's glad this format of discussion, this last component of today's event actually worked well. I'm very glad seeing that, because in the beginning we were thinking of having breakout rooms and we debated a little with Animesh and Kimberly and Rosalie, and we decided to go for this format. I'm very glad it works so well. I actually want to expand this to our whole Robotics Institute for our trainees to show up. We have a few themed questions and everybody can chip in. I think it's one way at least to share before we can see each other physically. So for that, it's my comment on the last component of today's event. But overall, the event is not just formality. I say, oh, congratulations, it's a great event. It's truly a phenomenal event in that it's not only going so smooth, more importantly, it's very informative. I think if you really think hard about what the panelists, what everybody's views were, don't just listen to the language. Think about the information that they're sharing. I did. And I think a lot of gold, real gold, not silver in there. For example, I'll give you a thought, something to think about after this event. So why did a lot of people say clinical evidence? And what does it mean, end users and clinical evidence? And again, I think next session, I will, and future sessions, I will raise the question again. I never believed there is a difference between industry and academia. If you truly understand both, the beauty, it lies in both. But if you only lie both feet or you only understand one side, you might become opponent of the other. They don't have to go head to head. Actually, there's beauty on both sides. If you understand both, I think the world becomes wider and becomes more beautiful. I do my best to learn. I'm close to 50. I don't know why I tell you my age, because I'm depressed. and I still keep learning from both sides. And the more you understand both sides, the more beautiful and synergistic the world becomes. I encourage our grad students to keep learning about both sides, but don't turn them one against another. Finally, I thank you for your attendance. I particularly thank Kimberly for coordinating the whole thing. I thank Animesh and Rosalie for being wonderful MCs, making my life so much easier so I have time to think and listen. And I think I was being selfish giving the work to you, but you are indeed both are way better MCs than I am. I'm not even qualified to be an MC. But anyhow, so I thank everybody's attendance. I hope you guys stay safe and cheer yourself up in this pandemic. And I look forward to seeing you on February 19th or earlier. That's all from me.
Yes, thank you so much. And if you do come up with anything or have any responses to anything that Sun has said, you can find us on Twitter. You can hashtag HeRo Summit to find some of the other tweets. It's been quite active today. And a final thank you. They're not here any longer with us, but to all of our panelists for taking the time out of their day. That was really impressive to be able to gather so many wonderful humans that created this amazing content. And don't forget about the second day of the summit, which is next Friday, the 19th. If you haven't registered for that yet, there's an Eventbrite, or you can go to the Robotics Institute website to find that information, or you can email me because I'll help you out there too. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good afternoon.